The ship moves slowly now. You can feel it in the floor beneath you, the great engines easing, the vibration that has carried you across the Atlantic for 8 days fading to something gentler, something that feels almost like stillness after so long at sea. Outside the porthole, the water has changed colour. It is grey-green now, not the deep Atlantic blue you watched for the first 3 days while America fell away behind you. The land is close. You stand at the railing in the early morning, wrapped in a wool coat that still smells faintly of cedar from the closet where it spent the summer. The mist sits on the water like something alive. You can smell England before you can see it. Coal smoke and salt air and something earthier beneath. The damp, dark smell of old soil, old land, a continent that has been accumulating its own weight since before your grandparents were born. Beside you on the deck there is a young woman in a grey travelling dress. She's standing very still, both gloved hands resting on the rail, looking at the shoreline as it emerges from the mist. She has not moved for several minutes. You have seen her at dinner every evening of the crossing, always with an older woman you have understood to be her mother, always in the most careful arrangement of silk and jewels, always perfectly composed in a way that looks effortless and costs everything. Now alone at the railing in the morning cold, she looks different. Her shoulders are held a little too tight. Her chin is lifted a little too high. The coast of England is materialising out of the grey, and she's watching it the way a person watches something they have agreed to but are not entirely sure about. Not with fear exactly, with the particular attention of someone who has made a decision that cannot be unmade. Her name, you will learn later, is one you have already read in the newspapers back home. She's one of perhaps a dozen young women on this crossing who are going to Europe, for reasons that everyone understands but no one says plainly. She's going to find a husband. Not just any husband, a title, a castle, a name older than the republic she was born in. And she is going, if the years ahead will prove it true, to stay. There is a particular kind of restlessness that wealth creates when it is very new and very large. It is not the restlessness of want. It is something more complicated than that, something closer to the restlessness of a person who has arrived at the top of a long staircase and found the door at the top locked from the inside. The money is there, the houses are there, the carriages and the gowns and the dinner tables lit with 100 candles are all magnificently, exhaustingly there. And yet, the drawing rooms of New York's most established families remain closed. The right parties do not include your name on the list. Your daughters are beautiful and accomplished, and worth more than most European nations, and still old Mrs. Astor turns her back. This is the world that made them. In the decades after the Civil War, a generation of American men built fortunes of a scale that had no precedent. Railroad magnates and steel kings and oil lords, men whose names became synonymous with a new American verb, to accumulate. They bought mansions on Fifth Avenue and summer cottages in Newport that were large enough to be called cottages, only in the specific and peculiar way that very rich people use words to mean the opposite of what they say. They filled these houses with European furniture and European paintings and European servants. But the one thing that European money could not simply be exchanged for was European standing. That required something else entirely. It required time. Old money in America looked down on new money with the practiced condescension of people who had been wealthy for 3 generations instead of 1. And America itself, for all its proclaimed freedoms, had developed its own rigid social architecture, its own 400, its own closed doors. The robber barons might own the railroads, but they could not buy their way into Caroline Astor's ballroom. They could not purchase the quiet ease of a family that had never needed to think about money at all. But Europe was different. Europe had something America did not, a titled aristocracy that was, by the final decades of the 19th century, in desperate financial trouble. The great English estates that had sustained ducal families for centuries were struggling under the weight of agricultural collapse, rising taxes, and the sheer extravagant cost of maintaining a way of life that had been designed for a world that was quietly disappearing. A duke might own 20,000 acres and still not be able to heat his own house. An earl might have his name in Burke's peerage and still find himself unable to repair his ancestral roof. And so the exchange was proposed. It was not always spoken plainly. It was conducted through London season parties and Newport introductions and the careful geography of ocean liner seating arrangements. But what it amounted to was this. The American father had the money. The English nobleman had the title. The American daughter stood in between them, expected to be beautiful and accomplished and grateful, and to want very little for herself beyond what she was told to want. Between 1870 and 1914, 454 American heiresses married into European noble families. By the time the phenomenon reached its height, American money had married into more than a third of the House of Lords. The total dowries carried across the Atlantic have been estimated in today's terms at something close to $25 billion. The Europeans got solvent, the Americans got titles, the women got a ship ticket and a castle, and a life that was, in almost every respect, nothing like the one they had been promised. This is the story of what happened when they arrived, and of the ones who, for reasons as varied as grief and love and ambition and something harder to name, simply never came back. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. The ship that carried Jenny Jerome from New York to Europe in 1867 was called the Scotia, and she was 13 years old. Her mother Clara had packed their trunks with a determination that suggested a one-way journey even then, before there was any specific plan, before there was any duke or earl or lord in mind. Clara Jerome had simply decided, with the particular resolve of a woman who has assessed her situation with clear eyes and found it wanting, that her daughters would do better elsewhere. New York society had grown tiresome and complicated. Paris had Empress Eugénie. England had the Prince of Wales. Opportunities of the right kind presented themselves more reliably on the other side of the Atlantic, and Clara Jerome was a woman who believed firmly in the geography of opportunity. The crossing itself took about 10 days on the faster steamships of the period, though the earlier packet ships could take 3 weeks or more depending on the weather. For the first days, the American coastline was still faintly visible on the western horizon, a low grey line that diminished slowly over the course of the morning, until it simply was not there anymore. Some of the young women on these crossings described watching that disappearance, with a specific kind of feeling they found difficult to name in their letters home. Not sadness exactly, not fear. Something in between. A sensation that something had been settled without their full consent. The first-class cabins on these ships were comfortable by the standards of the era, though the standard of the era was considerably more rigorous than what we would recognise as comfort today. The Atlantic was a serious ocean and treated itself accordingly. Storms could last for days. The ship would heave and roll through weather that kept everyone below decks, the woodwork groaning, the lamps swinging in their gimbals, the sound of water against the hull constant and enormous. Many of the young women were seasick for the first several days, confined to their cabins by an indignity that no amount of wealth or silk upholstery could prevent. But when the weather was good, and it was often good in the summer months when most of these crossings were made, the first-class promenades and smoking rooms and saloon dinners became something else entirely. They became a floating society, a temporary world with its own rules and its own very specific social possibilities. The passenger lists of these ships were often published in advance in the society pages of both New York and London papers, and the matchmaking possibilities were not lost on anyone. A crossing was not merely transportation, it was an audition. The young women who made these journeys in the 1870s and 1880s were, almost without exception, extraordinarily well prepared for what they were walking into. Or rather, they had been prepared for what their mothers imagined they were walking into, which was not always the same thing. They spoke French, usually competently and sometimes beautifully. They played piano and sang, and could converse on subjects ranging from politics to painting. They were trained to move through a room in a specific way, to manage a dinner table with its 16 separate pieces of cutlery, to receive a compliment with just enough deflection to seem modest without seeming cold. Consuelo Vanderbilt, who crossed the Atlantic as a young girl accompanying her mother Alva on a visit to Europe, later recalled the experience of those early visits to England as deeply confusing. The houses were enormous and cold. The servants had a way of looking at you that was simultaneously correct and subtly withering. The social codes were as elaborate as anything New York had to offer, but they were different codes, written in a language that looked like English, but operated according to principles that required years of immersion to even begin to decode. You could do everything right and still somehow do it wrong. The wrongness would be communicated to you not through words, but through a very slight quality in the silence that followed. For many of these young women, Europe first presented itself as a series of grand houses seen from the outside. The crossing to England was followed, almost immediately, by a season in London that consisted of an exhausting calendar of balls, garden parties, house parties, and presentations at court. Being presented at court was a significant event, requiring specific dress, specific movement, and a months-long waiting list for an audience with whoever happened to be on the throne. The presentation was formal, brief, and utterly essential. An American girl who had been presented at court occupied a different social position than one who had not, and the mothers of these girls understood this with the same precision they brought to calculating exchange rates. The London season ran from May through August, when Parliament was in session, and the great houses of Mayfair and Belgravia opened their doors to the social machinery of the English upper class. Everyone who mattered in English society came to London for the season. Country houses were closed, town houses were opened, the social calendar was printed in advance and adhered to with a discipline that would have satisfied a military officer. There were the right parties to attend and the right people to be seen with and the right way to hold your teacup, and the American girls arrived into all of this at full speed, most of them trailing mothers who'd done their research and were not about to waste the crossing. Jenny Jerome's mother Clara was among the first of this particular type, though she would not be the last. She had brought her daughters to Paris at a critical moment, just as the court of Napoleon III and Empress Eugénie was at its most brilliant, and the Jerome girls had grown up surrounded by French furniture and French language, and French notions of female beauty that were considerably more generous toward dark colouring and animation than the prevailing Anglo-Saxon aesthetic. When the Jerome family moved to England, Jenny was already, at 19, something quite specific. She was American enough to seem refreshingly unconstrained, and European enough to seem perfectly at ease in a drawing room. It was at a yachting event at Cowes on the Isle of Wight in August of 1873 that Jenny Jerome met Lord Randolph Churchill. She was 19, he was 23. The acquaintance lasted 3 days before he proposed. 3 days is a remarkably short time for a life-altering decision, but the Gilded Age ran on a different clock than we do, and the social season was not long, and men of Lord Randolph's position had other considerations to attend to when the season ended. The proposal was accepted. The families were horrified on both sides for different reasons. The engagement was announced. The crossing had already, in the most permanent way, been completed. What Jenny Jerome likely did not know on that bright August day at Cowes, watching the yachts and being watched in turn, was that she was beginning something that would not end in England. It would end in England eventually, but not in the way she imagined. She would become Lady Randolph Churchill, the mother of Winston Churchill, the friend of the Prince of Wales, the managing editor of a literary magazine, the organiser of a hospital ship. She would be more English than most English women while remaining, in some quality of energy and forward motion that even her enemies could not deny, entirely American, and she would never go home again. Not really. The crossing was a one-way door. Many of these women understood this on some level before they stepped aboard the ship. Some of them had been told so explicitly, by mothers who framed the absence of a return as an achievement rather than a loss. Some of them discovered it only when they were already on the other side of the water and found, to their surprise, that home had changed while they were gone, or that they had changed, or that the two had diverged in ways that could not be bridged simply by buying another ship ticket. The America they had left was a specific, vivid, deeply personal thing. The America they could return to was something more abstract, something that existed in letters and newspaper accounts and the expressions on the faces of visitors who came to admire the castle. The ship moved on. The coast of England grew clearer in the morning mist, and somewhere on the first-class deck a young woman in grey wool stood at the railing, her gloved hands on the cold iron, watching the land she had agreed to make her own. The arrival at Southampton, or at Liverpool for ships that took the northern route, was another managed transition. Customs officials who were trained to be efficient and slightly condescending. Porters who understood, without being told, exactly who was first class and who was not. Carriages, or, in the later years, motor cars waiting at the dock to take passengers to hotels or to train stations where the London trains departed on their careful schedules. The American girls who had never been abroad were encountering for the first time the particular quality of English public life, its assumption of order and hierarchy and the right way to do things, its mild and persistent suggestion that people who did not know the right way to do things were somewhat unfortunate. For the daughters of New York robber barons, this was both familiar and foreign in a specific way. They had grown up in households where enormous wealth coexisted with a gnawing social uncertainty, where the money was beyond question, but the position was always being established and defended. Now they were entering a world where the position was beyond question, but the money was frequently absent. The values were inverted, the currencies different, and learning the exchange rate was the work of the first several seasons. The trains from Southampton to London carried these women through the English countryside for the first time, and many of them recorded their impressions with the specific freshness of a traveller seeing something genuinely new. The English countryside in summer, which was when most of the crossings were made, was not like American countryside. It was smaller in scale and more intensively managed, fields bounded by hedgerows that had been growing in place for centuries, the villages at intervals with their stone churches and their high streets, and their quality of having been exactly where they were for a very long time. American landscapes were larger and rawer, still in the process of becoming themselves. England looked finished, completed, a landscape that had arrived at its final form and was simply maintaining it. This was both beautiful and, after a while, slightly oppressive. The completedness of England, its quality of having settled into itself long before these women arrived, meant that there was very little room for a newcomer to change anything about it. An American house could be redone, renovated, rebuilt to reflect the preferences of its new owner. An English country house was an argument made in stone over 3 centuries, and its owner's preferences were relevant only insofar as they were consistent with what the house had always been. The mothers, who had in many cases done more research and preparation for these crossings than their daughters, understood this. They had read the relevant guidebooks and corresponded with the relevant people, and formed their own assessments of what the market offered. They had understood, with the clarity of business women operating in a business that refused to call itself one, that the English aristocracy was looking for American money, and that American money was looking for English standing, and that the negotiations between these two positions were their job to manage. Not all the mothers were Alva Vanderbilt, who managed her daughter's marriage with the ruthlessness of a general, conducting a campaign she had been planning for years. Some of them were more genuinely open to the possibility that their daughters might find happiness in the arrangement, that the young man with the title might also be the right young man in a more fundamental sense. The stories that ended well, or better than expected, were usually the ones where the mother had not been quite so relentless, or where the daughter had been given some genuine choice in the matter, or where the available young nobleman was someone whose character and intelligence and attention had drawn the heiress toward him rather than simply allowing her to be pushed. Jenny Jerome's mother Clara was not Alva Vanderbilt. She was a social climber, certainly, and she had brought her daughters to Europe with a clear purpose. But she does not appear, in the record, to have forced Jenny's hand in the same way. The engagement to Lord Randolph Churchill was, by the evidence, something Jenny wanted. The fact that her father, Leonard Jerome, was initially reluctant, that he required detailed financial negotiations before he would agree to the settlement, suggests that the parental agenda and the daughter's wishes happened, in this case, to align. This made it unusual, or at least fortunate. The crossing was a threshold, and every woman who made it was crossing something more than an ocean. She was crossing from one version of herself to another, from the version that had grown up in the specific American context of her family, and her city, and her social world to the version that would be shaped by Europe, and all that Europe would ask of her. The ship was the space between those two versions, a no-man's land of 8 days or 10 days, where she was neither the person she had been nor yet the person she was going to become. Some of them used that in-between time well. They read, they thought. They stood at the railing in the morning and watched the water and allowed themselves to have the feelings they would need to put away once the land was under their feet again. The Atlantic in good weather was vast and impersonal, in a way that was genuinely restful, a space without social obligations or the requirements of dress, or the need to say the right thing to the right person in the right way. The water did not care who your father was. The weather did not make distinctions. The coast of England was real, and it was close now. The grey-green water was shallowing. The sky was brightening toward a particular kind of English morning brightness, not warm but clear, the light coming off the water in a way that made everything sharp and slightly formal. The first gulls appeared, wheeling around the ship with the professional assurance of birds that have been doing this since the first ships arrived. The pilot boat came out to meet them. She tightened her hands on the railing, not from fear, or not only from fear, from the specific sensation of a decision arriving at its final consequence. She had agreed to this. She was about to step into it. The water between the ship and the shore was very little now, and still diminishing. There was, at the height of the Gilded Age, a publication called Titled Americans. It was not distributed widely. It did not appear on newsstands beside the Harper's or the Century magazine. It circulated instead through the particular underground of very wealthy American mothers who were seriously engaged in the problem of European matrimony for their daughters, passed from drawing room to drawing room in Newport and Fifth Avenue with the studied casualness of something that everyone pretended not to have read. The publication did two things. It listed American heiresses who had already married into European nobility, their names and titles arranged with the solemn precision of a catalogue, and it listed eligible British bachelors, their titles, their ages, their estates, and their reputed fortunes or lack thereof. A quarterly journal that functioned, in a phrase that a later century would find amusing, as the Match.com of the Gilded Age. Entirely practical, not at all romantic, exactly what was needed. Reading the listing for a particular English earl in the 1890s, you would have found something like this. The holder of an ancient title with extensive lands in the Midlands, those lands presently encumbered by some decades of agricultural depression and the accumulated debts of a father who had spent freely on horses and art. The Earl himself was in his 30s, educated at Eton and Oxford, presentable in evening dress, known to be in the market for a connection that would restore the family's financial position. Inquiries to the following address. The business was conducted on both sides with a clarity that could strike the modern reader as startling. American heiresses were not being concealed or romanticised. They were being offered. Their dowries were discussed in advance with the specificity of commercial contracts. Minnie Paget, herself an early American heiress who had married well into English society, was among the most effective of the unofficial marriage brokers, a woman who had spent years accumulating exactly the kind of connections on both sides of the Atlantic that made her invaluable in these negotiations. It was said that she had spent $6 million entertaining the Prince of Wales over her career, an investment that paid dividends in introductions. The families that engaged brokers like Minnie Paget understood implicitly that they were paying for access. The broker did not receive a formal commission. The grateful mother of a successfully titled daughter might pay a season's bills, or give a piece of jewellery, or extend hospitality of a particular lavishness. The broker received the social currency of gratitude and the practical currency of connection. The whole arrangement operated in a grey zone between business and friendship that both parties maintained by never examining it too directly. On the English side, the mathematics were equally clear. The great agricultural depression of the 1870s and 1880s had devastated the incomes of the rural aristocracy. English noble families had for centuries derived their income primarily from their land, from the rents paid by tenant farmers, and the revenue from crops and livestock. When American grain flooded the European market, driving down prices, those rents declined, and that revenue dried up. At the same time, the costs of maintaining an ancestral estate had only increased. The roofs needed replacing. The drainage systems were failing. The servants required wages that had risen steadily as other forms of employment became available to them. The introduction of death duties in 1894 made the situation more acute. Inheriting an estate now meant paying the government a significant portion of its value, and if the previous generation had not had the foresight to set money aside, the new heir might find himself in the position of owning an enormous, expensive, crumbling house, and having no cash at all with which to do anything about it. The house could not easily be sold. It was the family seat. It was the physical expression of everything the family had been for 300 years. Selling it was not an option that an English nobleman could consider without a specific quality of internal devastation that is perhaps unique to the English relationship with their ancestral homes. An American wife, on the other hand, could be considered. She arrived with a dowry. The dowry was negotiated in advance, sometimes in considerable detail, with lawyers representing both families and documents drawn up that specified exactly what money would be paid, when, and in what form. Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage to the 9th Duke of Marlborough came with $2.5 million in railroad stocks and an annual income of $100,000 for life, paid to both husband and wife by Consuelo's father. The Duke used the money immediately, and extensively, to restore Blenheim Palace, the family seat in Oxfordshire that had been in steady decline for decades. By the time Consuelo arrived, the palace had no central heating and questionable hot water. She had grown up in American houses designed with every modern convenience. The negotiation of these marriage settlements was a delicate and often prolonged process that bore no resemblance to what was happening on the surface, in the drawing rooms and ballrooms where the young people were supposed to be falling in love. The surface was all glances and waltzes and carefully managed introductions. Below the surface, lawyers were meeting and figures were being discussed, and the essential question being settled was not whether two people suited each other, but whether the money on one side matched the title on the other. Not all of the American mothers who made these arrangements were callous about it. Some of them believed genuinely, with the optimism of people who had themselves made practical marriages that had grown into something warmer, that their daughters would find happiness in the arrangement once the arrangement was made. Some of them had assessed the available options for a wealthy American girl in 1895 and concluded, not entirely without reason, that an English duke offered more than a Newport playboy. The duke at least had duties to perform, and a household to manage, and a position in the world that required something of him. An idle American rich man might offer only his idleness. But the gap between what was promised and what was delivered was, in many cases, enormous. The castle in the brochure was damp and cold, and staffed by servants who had served the family for generations and had no particular interest in adapting their practices to the preferences of an American newcomer. The Duke, who had seemed distinguished and attentive during the London season, was, in his own home, a different creature entirely, governed by habits and routines so deeply established that a new wife was more an intrusion than an addition. The title that had sounded so splendid on the ship coming over looked different when it became the sum total of what you had in exchange for everything you had left behind. Mary Leiter, the daughter of a Chicago dry goods merchant who had made his fortune as a co-founder of the Marshall Field Empire, was one of the women who went to Europe and found something genuinely different from what most of her contemporaries encountered. She went to London in the early 1890s as a tall, beautiful, 6-foot young woman from Chicago with impeccable manners and a quality of natural grace that made her, by all accounts, remarkable even in rooms full of remarkable people. She met George Curzon, a rising member of Parliament with an intellect as large as his ambition and debts to match, and she fell in love with him in the specific and determined way that she apparently brought to everything she did. She wrote to a friend at the time that she would have George Curzon because she believed he needed her. That is a sentence worth pausing over, not because she loved him, though she did, not because he was titled, though he was, but because she had assessed him with clear eyes and decided that the best argument for the match was her own usefulness to him. It is a very particular kind of love, and it was not uncommon among the women who crossed the Atlantic in those years. They arrived in Europe with a practical understanding of what they were there for, and they applied that practicality even to their own hearts. The Book of Eligible Lords was read, the notes were made, the season was navigated, and one by one, in the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the country houses of the English Midlands, the arrangements were settled. The money changed hands, the woman changed her name, and the ship that had brought her over returned to New York without her. The London season itself was a machine of considerable social complexity. It ran from May to August, and its calendar was published annually, a schedule of events so intricate and so precisely organised that navigating it required either long experience or a very good social secretary. The first week in May typically brought the opening of the Royal Academy's summer exhibition, which served as an occasion for everyone who needed to be seen to appear and see each other. The Chelsea Flower Show followed, then Ascot, the racing at Epsom, the cricket at Lord's, the regattas at Henley and Cowes. Every event had its associated social requirements. Ascot required specific dress, specifically the hat, and the hat at Ascot was not merely a hat but a social statement of considerable precision. The wrong hat at Ascot communicated the same information as the wrong fork at dinner, which is to say it communicated that you were not quite right, that you had not grown up knowing these things in the way that people who had always known them knew them. The American girls who arrived in London for the season had usually done their research on this point, had consulted dressmakers and social advisors and the relevant chapters of the relevant guides. They appeared at Ascot in entirely correct hats. The correctness was its own kind of performance. The house parties were where the real work happened. From June through August, the great country houses opened themselves to guests who arrived on Friday evening and departed on Monday morning, filling the intervening days with the elaborate rituals of the English weekend, the shooting for the men, the visiting of the kitchen gardens and the greenhouses and the stables for those who wished to admire, the croquet on the lawns in the afternoons, the tea served in the library or on the terrace at 4 o'clock, the conversation of people who have known each other for years and are comfortable in each other's company, which is to say, the conversation that makes you feel most acutely, if you are new to it, that you're not yet inside it. The American girls attended these house parties with the careful attention of students in a demanding class. They observed who sat where and why. They observed the unspoken geography of the house, the rooms that were used for certain purposes and the rooms that were used for others and the moments when one shifted to the other. They observed the way that English people of this class managed conversation, the particular rhythm of topics and transitions, the way that seriousness was lightened and lightness was grounded, the way that the social temperature of a room was maintained at an even warmth without ever becoming too hot or too cold. Some of them were very good at it very quickly. Jenny Jerome, who had the natural social intelligence of a woman who had been paying close attention to social dynamics since she was old enough to understand them, was among the best. She had grown up in Paris and London with the benefit of her mother's sustained campaign of social education, and she moved through the English house party circuit in 1873 with the ease of someone who is not performing fluency but actually has it. Others found the house parties a prolonged ordeal of not quite rightness, a weekend-long exercise in almost but not quite belonging that was, in its cumulative effect, exhausting. The house was beautiful and cold. The other guests were distinguished and slightly closed. The food was good in a way that required you to comment on it correctly. The conversation was interesting if you could find your way into it, and finding your way into it required a very specific kind of confidence that grew over years, but was not available on your first English summer. The mothers watched. The mothers noted. The mothers had their own conversations with the hostesses who organised these gatherings, conversations that happened over tea and during walks in the garden and in the brief exchange before dinner, when the men had not yet joined the women in the drawing room. These were the conversations in which arrangements were suggested, in which the qualities of a particular young man were mentioned in connection with the qualities of a particular young woman, in which the groundwork was laid for the introductions that would happen at dinner or on the croquet lawn or during the Sunday visit to the local church. The church visits were particularly useful. The English church on Sunday morning was a social event as much as a religious one. The congregation assembled by the practical requirement of being in the same county for the weekend, and the social requirement of being seen to maintain the proprieties. It was also a public space in which people who had not been formally introduced could nonetheless observe each other at close range, could allow their eyes to meet across the nave during the sermon, could arrange themselves in the churchyard afterward so that an introduction could happen as if by accident. Jenny Jerome met Lord Randolph Churchill at a different kind of event entirely, a ball on a yacht at Cowes in August of 1873. The Cowes Regatta was one of the pinnacles of the summer season, the gathering of the sailing world on the Isle of Wight, and the social events that accompanied it were attended by a concentration of English nobility that made it, for American mothers with daughters to place, an exceptional opportunity. The Jerome women were there in full force. Clara had arranged for all 3 of her daughters to be present. Jenny was 19, freshly out, radiant by multiple accounts, and entirely prepared for whatever was about to happen. Blenheim Palace is one of the largest private houses in England. It sits in Oxfordshire in grounds designed by Capability Brown. The lake in front of it a perfect arrangement of reflected sky and tree line that looks, in the right weather, like a painting of itself. The approach by road is long and deliberately impressive, the great stone facade appearing through the trees with the calculated impact of something that has been positioned to make you feel small. It was built to celebrate a military victory. It has the geometry of a place designed to remind you, at every turn, of who matters and who does not. Consuelo Vanderbilt arrived at Blenheim for the first time as its new Duchess in November of 1895, having been married in New York 3 weeks earlier in a ceremony that the press had covered with the thoroughness reserved for state events. The wedding itself had been a masterpiece of her mother's social engineering. The church had been packed with 1,200 guests. The streets outside had been lined with crowds. The newspapers had run long accounts of the gown, the flowers, the attendants, the gift list. It was, by any external measure, a triumph. Consuelo had spent the morning of her wedding in tears, alone. A footman had been stationed outside her apartment to ensure that no one, not even her governess, was admitted. She had dressed in the wedding clothes arranged around her by maids she barely knew, the real lace and the white silk stockings and the shoes, moving through the ritual of preparation with the automatic competence of a young woman who'd been trained to perform regardless of what she felt. By the time her father came to collect her, she was composed. She was very good at being composed. It was one of the things she had been most carefully taught. The honeymoon was spent travelling in Europe, the new Duke managing his correspondence and receiving the congratulatory letters of the nobility, with the particular satisfaction of a man who had conducted a necessary transaction and found it to have gone well. It was during this honeymoon that he told Consuelo certain things she had not been told before. He told her that he had married her to keep Blenheim going, that the marriage had been necessary for the preservation of the estate, and that he intended never to return to America, as he despised anything that was not British. He said this, apparently without cruelty. He was simply being clear about the arrangement, stating the terms that had been implicit on both sides and were now explicit between them. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man of his time, for whom women were part of the management of a great estate and not much else. At Blenheim, Consuelo found no central heating and unreliable hot water, and a household staff of something like 40 people who had been doing things in a specific way for decades and saw no particular reason to change on account of an American duchess who didn't know how things were done. She found rooms of such extreme magnificence and such extreme cold that the magnificence seemed to be designed to prevent you from noticing the cold, or perhaps to justify it. She found a view from her bedroom window of a pond in which a former butler had drowned himself. She found a husband who, in the country, reverted to the habits and humours of a man who was entirely absorbed in the management of his property and the obligations of his position, for whom a wife was a social accessory and a dynastic necessity rather than a companion. The servants presented their own education. English country house servants operated according to a hierarchy as elaborate and codified as anything on the family side of the baize door. The butler was at the top, and the butler's authority in his own domain was nearly absolute. The cook had her own kingdom in the kitchen and did not welcome interference. The lady's maid, who had dressed the previous duchess and knew exactly how things should be done, had views about how a new duchess should conduct herself, and conveyed those views through a system of silences and small hesitations that Consuelo had to learn to read. Telling them how things had been done at her family's houses in America was not useful. It was not useful in the specific way that mentioning America at all was not useful, which was to say that it created a very slight quality in the air that signalled, without words, that this was a different country. The physical cold of an English country house in winter is not a comfortable thing to adjust to when you have grown up in houses with American central heating. The great fireplaces in the main rooms were impressive and largely decorative. The corridors were unheated. The bedrooms were heated by individual coal fires that required constant attention from a housemaid who appeared at intervals to tend them and whose comings and goings you were expected not to notice or acknowledge. The windows were large and draughty, and the stone floors, even under rugs, had a quality of cold that moved upward through your feet regardless of what you wore on them. American houses in the 1890s had central heating as a matter of course. English country houses often did not, on the grounds that comfort was an American preoccupation, and the English had been cold in their grand houses for centuries and saw no reason to change. Mary Lita Curzon, who became Lady Curzon upon her marriage to George Curzon and later the Viceroy of India, approached the English country house with a different temperament. She was a woman of remarkable natural ease, one of those people who could move into any environment and within a short time seemed to have always been there. The servants at Kedleston Hall, the Curzon family seat in Derbyshire, encountered in her someone who was genuinely interested in the house and its history and the way things were done, not from a desire to change them, but from a quality of attention that English servants, who spent their lives being not quite invisible, found unusual and rather touching. 6 feet tall and extraordinarily beautiful, Mary Curzon had a way of making people feel noticed that was entirely natural and entirely effective. She learned the names of the servants and used them. She learned which rooms were draughty and which were comfortable and arranged things accordingly. She learned the rhythms of an English country house weekend, the elaborate ritual of it, The guns and the dogs in the morning, and the elaborate dinners in the evening and the long Sunday afternoons with their particular quality of boredom that the English had somehow elevated into a social form. She learned all of it and made it look easy, because for her, in some fundamental sense, it was. Not all of the Americans were so adaptable. Some of them found the adjustment genuinely overwhelming, a culture shock administered slowly and without acknowledgement, through an accumulation of small moments of wrongness that no single one of which was large enough to complain about. You held your fork incorrectly. Your accent had a quality that made people repeat things back to you in a slightly different tone. Your references were to the wrong books, and the wrong events, and the wrong people. Your enthusiasm, which had been an asset at home, was here a little excessive, a little too forward, a little too American in a context where restraint was not merely preferred, but was itself a form of expression. The homesickness came in waves. Letters took 10 days or more to cross the Atlantic, and by the time a reply arrived, the original feeling that had prompted the letter had either resolved itself or deepened into something that a letter could not reach. The women who had come to Europe with mothers were better off in the early years, having at least someone from home at hand, but eventually the mothers returned to America, to their own lives and their own social calendars, and the daughter was left in the English house with the English husband and the English servants, and the particular quality of English grey sky that comes in October and does not fully lift until April. Consuelo, in her memoir published years later, wrote about those early years at Blenheim with the measured prose of a woman who has processed her unhappiness into something more usable. She described learning to manage the estate, learning to organise the household, learning the expectations that came with the title. She was a duchess. There were duties. There were people who depended on the duchess to be what she was supposed to be, and Consuelo Vanderbilt, whatever else she was, understood duty. She had been trained for it. She had simply expected it to feel different from this. The house that swallowed her was real and cold and magnificent, and cost her everything she had brought with her. The title was real, the castle was real, the life was real. She had simply not been told that real was not the same as happy, and that the distance between the two could be as large and as draughty, and as permanent as the space between the life you were handed and the one you might have lived. The seasons in an English country house had a rhythm that was not like American seasons. American seasons came and went with decisive declarations of themselves. The New England winters of Consuelo's childhood were cold, in a way that admitted no ambiguity. The summers of Newport were warm and bright and definitive. England was more equivocal. The winter was grey rather than white, damp rather than crisp, a long sustained diminishment of light that began in October and did not resolve until April. The spring when it came was tentative at first, the daffodils appearing in the park with an uncertainty that seemed appropriate, and then suddenly generous, the hedgerows white with hawthorn and the lanes smelling of something sweet and green. Learning to love the English seasons took years for most of the American women who made their lives in English houses. The ones who ended up loving them did so specifically, with the attention of people who have had to acquire a taste deliberately. They learned to recognise what the English called a fine day, which bore no resemblance to a fine day in the American sense, but which had its own quality, a brightness without heat, a clarity that was particular to northern latitudes, a quality of light bouncing off wet grass that was specific and precise, and, once recognised, entirely its own pleasure. The garden was central to the English country house, in a way that was different from the American relationship with the grounds of a property. An English garden was not merely decorative. It was historical, often centuries old in its basic arrangement, the bones of it laid down by someone who had been dead for 100 years, and whose intentions were legible in the positions of the yew hedges and the kitchen garden walls and the placement of the ha-ha that divided the formal grounds from the parkland. Managing a garden of this kind required engagement with the history of the thing, an understanding of what it had been meant to be, and what it had become, and what it was now possible to do within those constraints. Mary Lita Curzon had a garden at Kedleston that she engaged with thoroughly. She worked with the head gardener, who had been there for 20 years before she arrived, and who had the specific pride of a man who understood his domain completely, and was prepared to share his knowledge with an employer who was genuinely interested. She learned which beds were replanted annually, and which were permanent. She learned which varieties of rose did well in the Derbyshire soil, and which needed coaxing. She learned the timing of things, the weeks in April when you could expect the first bluebells in the wood, the month in which the walled kitchen garden began to produce enough for the house to stop depending on the market. This kind of knowledge, intimate and seasonal and accumulated through presence, was the opposite of the kind of knowledge that had got these women to England in the first place. The social knowledge, the knowledge of how to move through the correct events in the correct way, was performative and can be acquired relatively quickly by intelligent people who are paying close attention. But the knowledge of a specific house, in a specific place, the knowledge of what it does in different weathers and different seasons, the knowledge of the people who work there and what they need and how they think, that kind of knowledge cannot be bought or briefed or learned in a single season. It took time. For most of the dollar princesses, the first decade in their English houses was a decade of learning in the most fundamental sense, not the social learning of the debutante season, but the deeper learning of a person settling into a life. They were learning the house and the place and the people and the rhythms of the year, and they were learning simultaneously who they were in this context, what the specific combination of their own character and this specific setting was making of them. The kitchen, in most of these houses, was a domain they entered carefully, if at all. The cook was sovereign in the English country house kitchen, and her sovereignty was enforced not by explicit authority, but by the weight of custom and the practical reality that no one else knew how to manage the coal range and the timing of 12 courses for 40 people. American mistresses of English houses had sometimes made the mistake of attempting to reform the kitchen, to introduce American preferences or American methods, and had discovered that the cook's response ranged from polite incomprehension to something closer to Cold War. What worked better, as Consuelo and others learned, was to engage the cook as a partner in the management of the house rather than as a subordinate, to ask rather than direct, to show genuine interest in what the cook knew and how she knew it. The cooks in the great English houses had knowledge that was worth having, knowledge of traditional English cookery that was being documented in books and talked about in circles, and the American mistresses who treated them as authorities on their own domain got better results than the ones who treated them as obstacles. The management of a great English house was, ultimately, management of a very complex organisation, and the American women who came to these houses brought to that management the same qualities that their fathers had brought to the management of railroads and steel mills and retail empires, a willingness to work, a systematic intelligence, and the specific American assumption that things could be improved if you attended to them carefully enough. These qualities were not always welcome in houses where things had been done in a particular way for 200 years, but they were effective, and the English houses that had the benefit of American management were, in many cases, better houses for it. Jennie Jerome Churchill was not the kind of woman who could be managed. This was apparent to the Churchill family almost immediately, and it never stopped being apparent throughout the decades she spent in England. The Churchills were an old family with old family habits and old family expectations about the role of women in the running of a great household and a political career, and Jennie Jerome had grown up in a family where her father had made his fortune 3 times and lost it twice, and had a very specific quality of American conviction that rules were suggestions and obstacles were opportunities. She had brought that quality with her across the Atlantic, and it did not diminish. Lord Randolph Churchill was brilliant and erratic and self-destructive in ways that would eventually kill him, and Jennie's marriage to him was not, by the standards of the time, particularly unhappy, which is to say that it was not particularly anything. They were 2 people who had met on 3 consecutive days at a yachting event and had decided, on some combination of attraction and practicality, and the simple fact of available social energy, that they suited each other. They had 2 sons. They moved in the higher circles of English political society, and they lived for long stretches largely separate lives. This was not unusual. The English aristocracy of the Victorian and Edwardian eras had a very specific understanding of marriage as a social institution rather than a personal one, and the marriages of the great political families were managed accordingly. A wife attended the right events and managed the households and produced the required children, and her husband's affairs were, if they were conducted with sufficient discretion, her business to know about and ignore. The arrangement went both ways, in theory. In practice, the theory was more generously applied to the husbands. Jennie Jerome Churchill found other arrangements. She moved through English society with an ease that was noticed and discussed, accumulating the kind of social capital that came from being genuinely interesting, genuinely witty, and genuinely unconcerned with the conventions that other people treated as binding. She had an affair with the Prince of Wales, which was noted by his wife Princess Alexandra, with the particular forbearance of a royal consort who had many such things to forbear. She had affairs with men of politics and men of letters, and men who were simply very good-looking, and she conducted them in the manner of a woman who had decided early on that the English social contract entitled her to the same freedoms it extended to the men around her. What distinguished Jennie Jerome Churchill from most of her contemporaries, American and English alike, was not the affairs but the other things. She founded and edited a literary magazine. In 1899 she launched the Anglo-Saxon Review, a quarterly journal of literature and politics that published work by writers, including Henry James and the young Winston Churchill, and managed, over the course of its brief life, to be exactly as intelligent and exactly as expensive as Jennie intended it to be. It ran for 11 issues. It lost money magnificently. It was exactly the sort of project that a woman of her time and position was not supposed to undertake, and she was very good at it. When the Boer War began in South Africa in 1899, Jennie Jerome Churchill organised a hospital ship. She raised the funds through her own social connections. She recruited the medical staff. She oversaw the fitting out of the vessel with the same attention to detail she brought to organising a dinner party, which is to say with considerable thoroughness. The Maine, as the ship was named, sailed for South Africa and did genuine and substantial work there. Jennie visited her son Winston, who was serving as a war correspondent in South Africa. She was 45 years old and had been managing large complicated projects on both sides of the Atlantic for most of her adult life. What Winston Churchill said about his mother was this: "She shone for me like the evening star." He was a man who chose his words carefully, and that sentence is precise in a way that repays attention. Not warm, not maternal, not comforting, shining, radiant, present in a way that illuminated but did not necessarily warm. He loved her with the particular love of a child who has been more admired than held, who has received the full force of a parent's intelligence and ambition, without always receiving the simpler and more sustaining thing that children need. She was, by many accounts, a somewhat distant mother, absorbed in her own life, her political engagements, her entertainments, her affairs. She was also, in the specific and irreplaceable way that such things work, the reason Winston Churchill was who he was. He credited her American energy, her refusal to accept limitations, her belief that will and intelligence could overcome most obstacles, as foundational to his own character. The England that produced Winston Churchill was shaped in part by a woman from Brooklyn who never quite stopped being American, who took the English world she married into and bent it toward her own purposes with a force of personality that her son inherited and deployed on a rather larger stage. Lord Randolph Churchill died in 1895 at 45 from an illness that his contemporaries described with the euphemisms of the era, and that subsequent historians have generally identified as syphilis. Jennie was 41. She was a widow with 2 sons, a large social position, no particular capital to speak of beyond her connections, and absolutely no intention of retreating into the quiet widowhood that the conventions of the time would have prescribed. She wore black for the appropriate period. Then she stopped wearing it. She married twice more. Her second husband was a man 20 years her junior. Her third husband was 40 years her junior. Both marriages raised eyebrows in a social circle that had long since accepted that Lady Randolph Churchill's eyebrow-raising was a permanent feature of the social landscape, like the dome of St. Paul's or the particular grey of the Thames in November. She continued to write, to organise, to attend and host and move through the world, with the energy of a woman who had decided quite early that the world was interesting, and she intended to extract as much of it as possible. She died in 1921 at 67. The proximate cause was an injury sustained when she fell while wearing a new pair of very high-heeled shoes. This detail was reported in the press with a mixture of sympathy and something that was not quite amusement, the recognition that Jennie Jerome Churchill had lived in a specific and decided way, and was apparently going to die in one as well. The gangrene that developed from the injury led to the amputation of a leg and then to her death, quickly and suddenly. Winston, who was by 1921 a significant figure in British politics, was with her. She had been in England for 53 years. She had arrived at 19 and never lived anywhere else in any permanent sense. America for her had become a place of childhood, a country of memory rather than residence, present in her accent, which never fully disappeared, and in the particular quality of her ambition, which did not soften as she aged. She had crossed the Atlantic once, and the crossing had been, in every real sense, permanent. England had not made her English. It had made her something else, something that had no precise name, a woman with the social fluency of one country and the will of another, operating in the space between them with a freedom that neither could have given her entirely on its own. The drawing rooms where she had held court were gradually replaced by different drawing rooms. The political world she had navigated so skillfully shifted and changed around her. But the stamp she left on it, in the son she had raised and the connections she had built and the simple fact of having insisted for 5 decades that a woman from Brooklyn had as much right to matter as anyone in England, did not disappear when she did. What made Jennie Jerome Churchill remarkable, beyond the obvious things, was the quality of her attention to the world. She was genuinely curious in a way that did not diminish with age. She read widely and remembered what she read and connected it to other things she knew in the way of a person for whom ideas are not decorations but tools. She understood politics not as a spectacle to be observed, but as a system to be engaged with, and her engagement with it was practical rather than ideological, focused on what could be done and who could do it and what connections needed to be made. Lord Randolph Churchill's career had been both brilliant and self-destructive, a combination that Jennie navigated with the patient intelligence of a woman who has assessed her situation clearly. He rose rapidly in the Conservative Party in the 1880s, holding the position of Secretary of State for India and then Chancellor of the Exchequer before his political career collapsed in 1886 with an unexpected resignation that he had apparently expected the Prime Minister to refuse, and that was instead accepted with quiet relief. After 1886 he was no longer the force he had been, and his health deteriorated alongside his political standing. Jennie organised, managed and maintained the social and political world around Lord Randolph's diminishing capacities through the late 1880s and into the 1890s. She managed the London House and the social calendar and the correspondence and the steady stream of people who came to see Lord Randolph for political reasons and who often ended up in conversation with Jennie instead. She was the continuity in a household that its nominal head was increasingly unable to sustain, and she did this without the public acknowledgement that such work deserved, because that was how it worked. After his death in 1895, the scale of the work she had been doing became briefly visible, before it was redistributed into other channels. She had managed a political career and a household and a social position, and her own ambitions simultaneously for 20 years. The managing had kept her from being merely decorative, which was something. It had also kept her from being fully free to be whatever she might have been on her own terms, which was something else. The second marriage to George Cornwallis West in 1900 was to a man 20 years younger than she was. He was handsome and pleasant and not particularly substantive, and Jennie was 46 and did not especially require substance in a husband at this stage of her life. The marriage was received with a certain quality of raised eyebrow in English society that Jennie had long since ceased to find inhibiting. She had been raising eyebrows since 1874 and had found it a reasonably sustainable position. The marriage lasted 10 years before dissolving amicably. The third marriage, in 1918, was to Montague Porch, who was 40 years Jennie's junior. She was 64, he was 24. This was received with a quality of raised eyebrow that went somewhat beyond the second marriage, but Jennie had never been a woman who modulated her choices on the basis of what people would say about them. She and Porch were happy, by various accounts, in the specific way of two people who have found each other genuinely interesting across a very large age gap. He was in Nigeria most of the time on colonial service, which gave the marriage a particular texture of absence and anticipation that Jennie, who had spent decades of her first marriage in various forms of absence and anticipation, may have found familiar and not unwelcome. The work she left behind is not all recorded in the history books. The conversations that moved things forward, the introductions that connected people who needed to know each other, the letters written on behalf of people who needed a letter written in a voice that the recipient would take seriously, the kind of work that women of her position and her capacities did constantly, invisibly, in the margins of the official record, the work that made the official record possible while never appearing in it. Her son Winston, in the years after her death, spoke of her with the specific warmth of a man who knew exactly what he owed her and could not fully calculate the debt. He had inherited from her, by the evidence of everything he ever said or wrote or did, the American quality of believing that things could be made to go differently if you applied sufficient will to them. The English side of him, his father's side, understood duty and tradition and the weight of inherited obligation. The American side of him believed that none of these things were fixed, that the situation could be altered, that will and intelligence and the willingness to work harder than anyone else were the decisive factors in any contest. He needed both. The England that he saved in the specific crisis of the Second World War needed both, and the woman from Brooklyn who had crossed the Atlantic in 1873 with her mother's social ambitions and her own untamed curiosity had, through the simple mechanism of having a son and raising him the way she raised him, contributed to the survival of the country she'd made her own. There is a dress in a museum in London that was made for a woman named Mary Lita Curzon in 1903. It was made by Worth in Paris, which is to say it was made by the most important dressmaker in the Western world, and it was made for a specific occasion, a reception at the Government House in Calcutta, where Mary Lita Curzon was the Viceroy of India. The dress is cloth of gold embroidered with beetles' wings. Real beetles' wings, iridescent, each one placed by hand, thousands of them covering the entire surface of the gown in a shimmer that catches every light in a room and throws it back changed. It is one of the most extraordinary things ever worn by a human being, and it was worn by a girl from Chicago whose father had started out selling dry goods. Mary Victoria Lita had been born in Chicago in 1870, the eldest daughter of Levi Lita, who had gone into business with Marshall Field and helped build what would become one of the most successful retail empires in America. The family had money in the kind of uncomplicated abundance that allowed them to move, when Mary was 11, to Washington, D.C., where they entered a different kind of society, the Society of Official Washington, presidents and senators and foreign ministers, a world that was more international in its orientation than the purely social world of New York and Newport. In London in 1890, Mary Lita met George Curzon at a ball. He was a member of Parliament, 30 years old, an Asian expert, and possessed of an intellect and an ambition that were both so large they were almost physical presences in a room. He was also possessed of debts, accrued through an extravagant lifestyle that his parliamentary salary could not sustain. He had been to Central Asia and written books about it. He had a kind of imperial vision of England and its role in the world that was absolutely of its time and place, and that Mary Lita found apparently rather compelling. He was not immediately in love with her. He was careful. He was also, at the time they met, still entangled with another woman, and he required several years to disentangle himself and arrive at a clarity of feeling that satisfied him. Mary waited. She was not passive in her waiting, she was present in London each season, making herself available without being obvious about it, navigating the social world with the ease that characterized everything she did. She wrote to a friend, at some point during this extended courtship, that she intended to have George Curzon because she believed he needed her. She added that she had no shame about this. Both statements were entirely characteristic. They married in Washington in April of 1895. His debts were paid by her family. The dowry was $200,000. The annual income from her father's estate that would sustain them both was generous and reliably paid. George Curzon was not a man who would have described himself as marrying for money, and in the most important sense he was right. He married Mary Lita because she was extraordinary. But the money helped, and both of them understood this, and neither pretended otherwise. 3 years after the wedding, George Curzon was appointed Viceroy of India. He was 39 years old. It was the highest administrative position in the British Empire, the governing of a subcontinent with 400 million people, an appointment that would have been the defining achievement of most political careers. For Curzon, it was the natural culmination of everything he had been building toward. For Mary, it was something more complicated, a promotion to the highest official rank a woman could hold in the British Empire, second only to the Queen herself, and also a journey to a climate and a set of conditions that would, over 6 years, slowly destroy her health. They arrived in Calcutta on the last day of December 1898, to a reception of such elaborate magnificence that even Curzon, who expected magnificence and had prepared his own version of it, was moved. Mary was greeted as what she had become, a great lady. An Indian poet composed verses in her honour. 100,000 people lined the streets to watch the procession. The government house, the official residence, was a palatial building modelled on Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire, the Curzon family seat, a coincidence of architecture that George Curzon found pleasing and that Mary found perhaps slightly amusing. As Viceroy, Mary Curzon did something that had not been done before in the role. She genuinely engaged with India, not with the abstract idea of India as an administrative problem or a colonial project, but with India as a place full of specific, remarkable people and traditions that deserve the same careful attention she brought to everything else. She visited temples and palaces and rural villages. She paid attention to the condition of women and children in a way that went beyond social obligation. She negotiated the complex social terrain of British India, where European and Indian aristocracies existed in a hierarchical proximity that required constant management, with the same natural ease she had brought to the English country house. She was also, in the most literal sense, the fashion of her world. The peacock dress from Worth, the cloth of gold with the beetle's wings, was one of several extraordinary gowns she had made for the ceremonial occasions that filled the viceregal calendar. These were not vanities exactly, though they were certainly beautiful. They were part of the job. The Viceroy and Vicereine of India were the physical representatives of the British Crown, and the spectacle they presented was a carefully managed political statement about British power and British taste. Mary Curzon, who had grown up in a family where beauty and abundance were understood as social tools, grasped this instinctively and deployed it with considerable skill. But India was costing her. The climate was brutal. The ceremonial calendar was unrelenting. She had 3 pregnancies in India, the last of which, a miscarriage, led to a severe infection that her body, already depleted by the heat and the years, could not fully recover from. By 1905, when Curzon resigned the viceroyalty after a bitter dispute with the British government, Mary was already failing. They returned to England, to Kedleston and the London house, and the social world she had navigated so brilliantly for a decade, and she continued to manage all of it because she was constitutionally incapable of not managing things. But she was 35 and she moved through the world like a woman who is already paying a debt she cannot quite cover. She died in July of 1906 at 36. George Curzon was with her, and the grief he felt was, by all accounts, the most genuine and overwhelming thing that ever happened to him. He had been a difficult man to love, cold and exacting and absorbed in his own brilliance. But he had loved Mary Lita Curzon with a completeness that surprised everyone who had observed the early years of the marriage. He erected a monument to her memory in the church at Kedleston that is still there. He never fully recovered from her death. Everything he did afterward, and he did a great deal, from serving as Foreign Secretary to almost becoming Prime Minister, was conducted in her absence in a way that was somehow always present. The peacock dress survived her. It is behind glass now, iridescent still, the beetle's wings catching the light exactly as they did in the government house in Calcutta 120 years ago. It is the most famous thing she left behind, which is both appropriate and somewhat unjust, because what she actually left behind was far more substantial, a model of how to inhabit a role fully, with intelligence and grace and the kind of genuine attention that makes the people around you feel seen. She did not come to India to perform the role of vicereine. She came to be it, fully, in every room and every conversation and every careful gesture toward a world that was not entirely her own. She had come from Chicago. She had gone to London, then to India, and then back to London, and she had died at 36, younger than most of the women in this story, and she had in her brief time managed to become the highest-ranked American woman in the British Empire, and also, which is perhaps more remarkable, someone that people genuinely mourned. The Viceregal Lodge at Shimla, the summer capital of British India, was where the Curzons retreated during the hottest months of the year. The lodge sat in the foothills of the Himalayas at 7,000 feet, above the worst of the heat, surrounded by pine forests and the specific clarity of mountain air that made the view in every direction something between a painting and a revelation. Mary loved Shimla. The altitude suited her. The landscape was unlike anything she had seen in Chicago or Washington or London, the mountains a scale of thing that had no equivalent in the world she'd grown up in. In Calcutta, in the winter months, the ceremonial responsibilities were unrelenting. Government House was the physical expression of British authority in India, and every event held there was designed to demonstrate that authority through the medium of spectacle. The state dinners for visiting dignitaries, the durbars, the formal ceremonies of reception at which the princes of the Indian states presented themselves and were received, the garden parties at which the social life of official Calcutta conducted itself with all the elaborate protocols of a society that was governing an enormous empire and was acutely conscious of the need to appear to be doing so with confidence. Mary stood at the centre of all of this with a grace that observers consistently described as effortless, though it was clearly anything but. She had prepared carefully for each occasion, researching the background of every significant visitor, learning the titles and the customs and the specific sensitivities of the Indian princes who attended the durbars. She was trying to do something more difficult than simply performing the ceremonial role she had been assigned. She was trying to do it in a way that respected the people she was receiving, and the people she was receiving included some of the most significant figures in the Indian world, men whose ancestors had governed for centuries and who were observing the British Viceroy and his American wife with the particular attention of people who have decided to assess something for themselves. The story of the sherry soup belongs to this world, the world of the vice-regal table at Calcutta in 1905. A dignitary guest who was teetotal had arrived for a formal dinner at which the English guests expected wine to flow freely with every course. Mary solved the problem with the pragmatic creativity that she brought to everything. She instructed the chef to add sherry to the turtle soup, which was served early in the meal, before the abstaining guest had committed himself to full attention to what was being poured around him. The sherry in the soup satisfied the English guest's need for alcohol with their first course. The guest, who was not drinking wine, had no particular reason to object to a flavouring in the soup. Everyone's needs were met without confrontation. Lady Curzon's soup, as it became known, made its way into the canon of British formal dining, and remained there for decades. It is a small thing, a single recipe surviving from a dinner table in Calcutta more than 100 years ago, but it carries the specific quality of Mary Lita Curzon's intelligence, practical, attentive to the actual situation rather than the theoretical one, and producing a result that satisfied everyone's requirements without making anyone uncomfortable. This was, by all accounts, how she operated in every context. George Curzon's resignation from the Viceroyalty in 1905 came after a bitter dispute with Lord Kitchener, the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, over the question of which of them had final authority over military matters in India. Curzon believed, correctly by the constitutional position, that civilian authority should prevail. Kitchener had the ear of the government in London. The dispute was resolved against Curzon in a way that he experienced as a betrayal by the country he had served so completely, and that damaged his confidence in his own standing in the political world. Mary's illness during this period was severe enough that she could not always accompany her husband at the public events that the vice-regal calendar required. She managed what she could and rested when she had to, with the discipline of a woman who had been managing her own health around her obligations for years. The miscarriage and the infection that followed had left her with a vulnerability that the climate and the demands of the role only worsened. She knew she was ill, she managed it. She did not discuss it publicly, or allow it to alter the face she presented to the world. Back in England in 1905, she was 35 years old and she was dying, though the dying would take another year and she would not allow it to be the defining characteristic of that year. She continued to manage Kedleston and the London house. She continued to be the person that George Curzon relied on for everything that was not purely political. She continued, in the private domestic world of their marriage, to be the person who understood him, and who he could speak to without the performance of greatness that his public life required. When she died in July of 1906, George Curzon sat with her body for a long time. He wrote later that the light had gone out of his life. He had been a man of enormous ego and enormous certainty, and her death revealed to those who knew him well the extent to which she had been the ground beneath both. He went on. He became Foreign Secretary and almost became Prime Minister. He did the work. But the quality of something that had sustained him was gone, and the absence was visible to anyone who'd known him before and after. In the autumn of 1887, a young woman named Winnaretta Singer found herself in a Paris apartment on her wedding night, standing on top of a large wardrobe. She was holding an umbrella. Her new husband, Prince Louis de Say-Montbéliard, had approached her bedroom with what he presumably considered reasonable matrimonial intent. Winnaretta's response was to climb the wardrobe, take up the umbrella, and announce in terms that left no room for misunderstanding that she would kill him if he came near her. The prince retreated. The marriage was not consummated. 5 years later, it was annulled by the Catholic Church. This is not the beginning most Gilded Age heiress stories have, but Winnaretta Singer was not most Gilded Age heiresses. She was the 20th of the 24 children of Isaac Singer, inventor of the Singer sewing machine, one of the most commercially successful inventions of the 19th century, and the fortune that invention had generated was so enormous that even the 20th of 24 children had what most people would describe as an inconveniently large inheritance. She had grown up in Yonkers, then Paris, then in a 115-room palace in Devon called Oldway Mansion, which her father had built with the specific intention of making it the most impressive house in the west of England. Isaac Singer, who had made his money by making a machine that replaced the work of women's hands, was not himself a particularly admirable figure. He had multiple simultaneous families and was sued for bigamy, and conducted his personal life with an expansiveness that was charitable only if you were not one of the women involved. But he had given his children money, and Winnaretta had taken her share and decided to do something interesting with it. What she wanted, and had known she wanted since she was very young, was music. On her 13th birthday, she had asked to hear a performance of Beethoven's string quartet. This was not a typical request for a girl of 13 in any social circle, and it was especially unusual in the world of Gilded Age American wealth, where culture was decorative and music was something you listened to at concerts to show that you had attended. Winnaretta wanted to understand music, to know it from the inside, to be part of it in the way that only regular and serious engagement allows. She played piano with genuine skill. She understood composition and theory. She had, in short, a relationship with music that was as serious as anything else about her. After the failed first marriage, Winnaretta needed a solution to a specific problem. As an unmarried woman, even a very wealthy one, her social position was constrained. To do what she wanted to do, to establish the kind of salon she was imagining, to move through Parisian society with the freedom required to engage with artists and composers and writers on her own terms, she needed a name, a title, and a husband who would leave her entirely alone. In Prince Edmond de Polignac she found all three. Prince Edmond de Polignac was 59 years old in 1893 when he married Winnaretta Singer. He was an amateur composer of genuine ability, a gay man of refinement and sensibility who had lost his fortune in the stock market, and who was, by temperament and conviction, as uninterested in physical congress with women as Winnaretta was in physical congress with men. The marriage was what the French called a mariage blanc, an unconsummated union undertaken for social purposes by people who understood exactly what they were doing. Both of them loved music. Both of them wanted a salon. Both of them needed the other's social and financial resources to make it work. By all accounts, it worked beautifully. The Prince and Princess de Polignac established their salon at their mansion on Avenue Henri Martin in 1894, and what they created there over the following decades was one of the most significant gathering places for artistic and musical talent in the history of modern Paris. This is not hyperbole. The guest list at a typical Polignac soirée included Claude Debussy, Gabriel Fauré, Maurice Ravel, Eric Satie, Igor Stravinsky, Marcel Proust, Oscar Wilde, Virginia Woolf. First performances were given there. Commissions were extended. Composers who needed money and space to work found both through the princess's patronage in a way that changed what they were able to create. Prince Edmund died in 1901, after 8 years of this companionable and productive arrangement. Winnaretta mourned him. He had been her genuine friend, her collaborator in the great project of the salon, the person with whom she had shared the specific pleasure of musical intelligence and the specific pleasure of a life arranged exactly as you want it to be. After his death, she continued alone, continuing to hold the salon, continuing to commission and support composers, continuing to move through Parisian society as the Princesse de Polignac, the title her second husband had given her and that she would keep for the rest of her life. Her affairs, conducted with the discretion that her position required, were with women. The painter, Romain Brooks, the composer and suffragette Ethel Smith, who fell in love with Winnaretta with an intensity that Winnaretta found touching and somewhat exhausting. The writers Virginia Woolf and Violet Trefusis, the pianist Renata Borgatti. The list is long and distinguished, and represents in its way a map of the most interesting women in Europe in the first decades of the 20th century. Winnaretta occupied the same left-bank world as the writer Natalie Barney, who ran her own famous lesbian salon, but the two maintained a careful social distance. Barney was extravagantly public about her sexuality in a way that Winnaretta considered unwise and unnecessary. They pretended, with the elaborate courtesy of women who understood the same social game, not to know each other. Marcel Proust wrote about her in Le Figaro with characteristic indirection, suggesting that the only marital difficulty between the happy Polignacs was the prince's tendency to catch cold and the princess's fondness for fresh air. He was being funny and careful simultaneously, in the manner of a man who spent his entire career being funny and careful about things that could not be said plainly. Everyone in Parisian society understood what he was saying. No one said so directly. This was how it worked. What Winnaretta Singer did with her sewing machine inheritance, her wardrobe, her umbrella, and her second husband's name was something that could not have been done in America, or at least not in America as it was in 1887. The specific combination of enormous wealth, a European title, and a social world capacious enough to accommodate a woman of her particular orientation required Europe, required Paris specifically, required the Belle Époque understanding that art was worth protecting at whatever social cost its practitioners required. In New York, she would have been a very wealthy woman with eccentric tastes. In Paris, she was the Princesse de Polignac, and that made all the difference. The salon continued until 1939, when the war that had been gathering over Europe for years finally arrived and changed everything. Winnaretta left France for England, where she died in November of 1943 at 78. She had been born in Yonkers, and she died in London, and in between she had spent 60 years in Paris making music happen. Ravel and Poulenc and Saint-Saëns and Satie and Chabrier and Indy and Fauré and Debussy, all of them had played in her rooms, all of them had in some degree benefited from her sustained and serious attention. The Fondation Singer Polignac, named for both herself and her husband, continued after her death, funding musical performance and composition. Winnaretta Singer had come to Europe and stayed, and what she had done there was not nothing. It was a great deal. It was, in fact, exactly what she had intended when she climbed that wardrobe in 1887, and announced, in terms that could not be misunderstood, that she intended to live her own life. The specific music that came out of the Polignac salon is worth dwelling on. Gabriel Fauré, whose Requiem is among the most beautiful pieces of music in the Western tradition, was a regular guest and beneficiary of Winnaretta's patronage. Maurice Ravel, who had grown up in a French Basque family and had come to Paris to study music at the Conservatoire, found in the salon the kind of sustained and serious attention to his work that his early career required. Igor Stravinsky, whose Rite of Spring had caused a riot at its premiere in 1913, and who was one of the most consequential musical minds of the 20th century, was a regular visitor. Erik Satie, the eccentric and influential composer who lived in poverty for much of his life, and whose quiet, stripped-down musical style was unlike anything else being composed in Paris, was a figure whose work Winnaretta engaged with seriously when many others dismissed it as insufficient. She had a quality of musical intelligence that went beyond social patronage, beyond the funding of composers in order to be surrounded by significant people. She heard what was genuinely new, and she supported it before it had been validated by anyone else's approval. The relationship between money and art is always complicated, and the relationship between Winnaretta Singer's money and the music she supported was more complicated than most, because she was not simply funding composers as a form of social decoration. She was funding the specific music she believed should exist, the music whose creation she thought the world required. The commissions she made were specific, not general. She asked for particular pieces. She had conversations with composers about what they were trying to do. She sat in the music room and listened with the complete attention of someone for whom music was not background but foreground. The music room in the mansion on Avenue Henri Martin was one of the best designed private music rooms in Paris. Its proportions and its acoustic properties had been attended to with care, so that the sound in the room had the quality of a space that had been made for music rather than adapted to accommodate it. The grand piano was positioned correctly. The seating was arranged so that listeners were in the right relationship to the performers. These details mattered, and Winnaretta understood that they mattered, and she had spent money and attention getting them right. The soirées musicales that she held in this room, particularly in the years before the First World War, were events of a kind that no longer exist in quite the same form. They were private concerts, but private concerts at which the audience was itself composed of significant people, and the interaction between the musicians and the listeners was not the formal, separated interaction of a public concert hall, but something more immediate. Composers heard their work performed and discussed in the same room, by people whose musical intelligence was genuine rather than social. Performers encountered an audience that was paying the kind of attention that performers dream of. Claude Debussy, whose Pelléa et Mélisande had its first private performance in Paris Salon before its public premiere at the Opéra Comique in 1902, was one of the many composers who benefited from the existence of the salon culture that Winnaretta had helped to create and sustain. The specific patronage she offered, the combination of financial support, social prestige, and a room full of people who would listen seriously, was not available anywhere else in Paris in quite the same form. After the First World War, the Salon's character changed somewhat. The generation of composers who had been young in the 1890s and 1900s were now middle-aged, and a new generation was emerging that had been shaped by the war and by the specific quality of disillusion that followed it. Francis Poulenc, a member of the group known as Les Six, was among the younger composers whom Winnaretta supported in the 1920s and 1930s. The music they were making was different from the music of Fauré and Debussy, less lush and more spare, less concerned with beauty as an end in itself, and more interested in irony and displacement. She adapted. This was perhaps her most significant quality, the one that allowed the salon to function for 45 years rather than 10. She was genuinely capable of updating her tastes, of hearing new things and finding them interesting rather than threatening. An older woman with a large fortune could very easily have become conservative in her musical preferences, comfortable with the known and suspicious of the new. Winnaretta did not become this. She remained curious, and her curiosity kept the salon alive as a living thing rather than a monument. The salon ended in 1939 when the war came, and after it ended she did not try to reopen it. She was 74 by then, and the Paris she was returning to was not the Paris she had left, and the specific world of the Belle Époque and its Edwardian aftermath, the world of the soirées musicales and the brilliant conversations and the late evenings in the music room that smelled of candle wax and perfume and the particular excitement of a new piece being heard for the first time, that world was gone, and she knew it was gone, and she did not insist on its continuation in a changed world. The winter mornings at Blenheim had a specific quality that Consuelo Vanderbilt Marlborough came to know very well. The light came slowly through the high windows of the bedroom, grey and diffuse, the kind of light that suggests the sun has made an effort and given up. The fires had been lit by a housemaid at 6 o'clock, which meant that by 8 the room was tolerable, but not warm, the cold retreating from the centre of the space while the corners held it. The breakfast tray arrived with its particular silverware, everything polished to a correctness that implied standards she had inherited rather than chosen. The day was arranged before her, its schedule determined by the requirements of the estate, and the social season, and the expectations of a position she had not sought. She had been 20 when she married the Duke. He was 23. They were, in the arrangement of things, very young people who had been placed in a very old situation, and expected to inhabit it fully. The estate required management, the tenants required attention, the household staff required direction. There were social obligations of a complexity and weight that had no equivalent in her previous experience. There were the Duke's political obligations, his seat in the House of Lords, the various committees and country concerns that occupied the attention of a man of his position. There was the question of an heir, which was not asked directly, but was present in the quality of every silence when that subject was adjacent. What kept Consuelo Vanderbilt functioning through those early years at Blenheim was something she might not have predicted. She was genuinely good at the job, not the dynastic parts, not the marriage itself, but the work of being a duchess in a practical sense. She learned the names and circumstances of the tenants on the Blenheim estate, and took a real interest in their welfare. She organised charitable work for women and children in the surrounding area, with the methodical efficiency of someone who had grown up watching a very capable mother manage large social operations. She sat on committees and chaired meetings, and brought to the business of doing good in the county the same thorough preparation she brought to everything else. The tenants at Blenheim, who had lived on the estate for generations and had views about the proper conduct of those above them in the social order, recognised in the new American Duchess something they had not entirely expected. She was not condescending. She was not frightened of them. She looked at them directly when they spoke, which some of them found disconcerting, and which all of them eventually found respectful. She knew their names and their children's names and the state of their roofs and the quality of their harvests in a way that suggested genuine attention rather than performed interest. The marriage itself was something else. The Duke, whose nickname within the family was Sonny, was not a cruel man. He was a cold one. He had the English aristocratic habit of treating the management of emotion as a purely private affair, and in his private affairs he was, by most accounts, managed very poorly. He was unhappy in ways he could not identify or articulate, driven by a sense of duty so large it crowded out everything personal, responsible for a house that represented his family's entire sense of itself and that was consuming money he did not have. He had needed an American heiress and he had got one, and he behaved toward her with the distant correctness of a man who has met his obligations and considers the account settled. They separated in 1906, 11 years after the wedding, in the quiet way that such separations were managed in English society. No announcement, a gradual withdrawal from shared spaces, the maintenance of a public front that concealed what everyone who knew them well understood. The actual divorce did not come until 1921, and the annulment by the Vatican, which required Alva Vanderbilt to testify that she had forced her daughter into the marriage, came in 1926. The legal machinery was slow and elaborate, as was appropriate for an arrangement that had been slow and elaborate to construct. By the time the marriage formally ended, Consuelo had been in England for 30 years, and was no longer the young woman who had stood at the altar in tears. She was 50 years old. She had 2 sons. She had rebuilt Blenheim's finances and managed its household and done good work in the county, and had been a very good duchess in every way except the one that mattered to her most, which was the way of being happy. She had also, somewhere in the course of those 30 years, become English in all the ways that counted from the outside. Her accent had shifted. Her social reflexes were those of her class and context. She moved through the English world as a known and respected figure, not as a visitor from across the Atlantic. After the separation, she fell in love. His name was Jacques Balsan, a wealthy French aviator with the kind of face that painters wanted, and the kind of ease that some people simply have and others never manage regardless of circumstance. He had been one of Coco Chanel's lovers. He was friends with the Wright brothers. He was, in short, exactly the sort of person the world Consuelo had been living in for 30 years would describe as unsuitable, which may have been part of his appeal. She married him in 1921, the same year her divorce from Marlborough was finalised. She was 44. With Balsan she found what she had been looking for since 1895 without knowing how to name it. A life lived by choice rather than by arrangement. They had houses in France and in America. They travelled. They were by all accounts genuinely happy, in the uncomplicated way of people who have found the right person, after several decades of looking without quite knowing they were looking. The Vanderbilt money, which had always been substantial, was now deployed in ways that reflected her own preferences rather than the requirements of a ducal estate. She wrote a memoir in 1953 when she was in her 70s, called The Glitter and the Gold. It is one of the very few contemporary accounts of the Dollar Princess experience written from the inside, and it has the quality of a document produced by someone who has processed everything carefully and arrived at a kind of clarity that is not quite peace and not quite anger, but somewhere in between. She described her wedding day without self-pity but without softening. She described Blenheim's cold and the Duke's coldness with the same measured prose. She described the years of work and the gradual discovery of herself as something other than an heiress or a duchess. The Glitter and the Gold was her own choice of title, and it tells you what she thought about the exchange. The glitter was real. The gold was real. Both were also, in the sense that mattered most, insufficient. The title had not been what they told her. The castle had been exactly what they described and nothing like what they meant. The things that turned out to matter, the small charities, the tenants' children, the friend who arrived one day and stayed, the particular quality of an afternoon in France with a man who was glad to see her, were not in the brochure. She was buried at her own request at St. Martin's Church in Blaydon, the parish church for Blenheim Palace, in 1964. She was 86 years old. She had outlived her duke by 25 years, and outlived her second husband too, and she had lived a very long time in several countries with several names, and she had written the book that told the truth about what the exchange had actually cost. The grave is in the churchyard in the shadow of the palace she came to at 20 and never quite left, even when she was gone. It is a very English thing, a churchyard in Oxfordshire in November, the elms bare and the light low, and the stone dates chiselled in the familiar notation of a life. She had been born in New York and she had ended here, and the distance between those 2 points was not only geographical, but a full and specific life. Jacques Balsan had been, before Consuelo found him, one of the most interesting people in France. He had been a cavalry officer and then a pioneer aviator, among the first generation of men who flew not because it was practical, but because it was possible, and because the possible had never seemed to them a sufficient reason to stop. He had been friends with the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk, and he had been one of Coco Chanel's lovers, and he had made his own substantial fortune in aviation and textiles, and he moved through the world with the ease of a man who's never had to prove himself, because he has simply never questioned whether he was sufficient. This quality, the quality of ease, was what Consuelo had been missing for 30 years at Blenheim. Not ease with the world, which she had developed in abundance through sheer application, but ease within herself, the ease of not performing, of not being assessed and found slightly wanting by a standard that was not quite human, of being in company where the question of whether she was correct did not arise because correctness was not the relevant measure. With Balsan, she lived in France and in America and travelled widely, and the life she led was almost nothing like the life she'd spent 3 decades learning to manage. They had houses that were beautiful rather than magnificent, large enough for comfort and for the kind of gathering she liked, but not so large that the house itself became the point. They entertained people who were interesting rather than important, or who were both, or who were merely good company, and the distinction did not matter because she no longer needed to manage a room for dynastic reasons. She wrote in the 1950s, in the final decade before her death, with the specific freedom of someone who has outlived most of the people who might have been made uncomfortable by her honesty. The Glitter and the Gold is written in clear, measured prose that is both candid and controlled, the memoir of a woman who has decided to be truthful within the form and who understands that the most powerful truths are the ones delivered without drama. She does not vilify the Duke. She's not sentimental about herself. She describes the wedding morning with the same even tone she uses to describe the kitchen gardens at Blenheim or the first time she met her future mother-in-law. What she describes, in the passages that carry the most weight, is the discovery of her own capacities through the work she did in England despite the circumstances of her marriage, the charitable work, the management of the estate, the raising of the 2 boys, the gradual accumulation of competence and confidence, and the specific satisfaction of doing something well that you were not obligated to do well but chose to, because the alternative was to let the life pass without leaving any mark on it. The English tenants she had worked with during her years at Blenheim are present in the memoir with a warmth that is entirely characteristic. She had genuinely liked them, and they had genuinely liked her, and this reciprocity was one of the things that had made the years at Blenheim bearable when almost nothing else did. She describes them as people rather than as background, which was, in the early 20th century context, rather unusual for the memoir of a duchess. She died in 1964, as noted, buried at Blaydon at her own request. Her son John, the 10th Duke, managed Blenheim through the middle decades of the century, with the attention his mother had taught him to bring to the place. The palace that Consuelo's Vanderbilt money had helped to restore and sustain was, by the time of her death, a tourist attraction, as well as a family home, open to visitors who paid to walk through the rooms and admire the painted ceilings and the long library, and the collections of paintings and furniture that 300 years of Churchills had assembled. The visitors who come to Blenheim today walk through those rooms without knowing, usually, that an American heiress cried on her wedding morning and managed the household for 11 years, and went away and stayed away, and was still, at the very end, buried in the churchyard at the gates. The palace does not tell you that. It tells you about the military victory it commemorates and the Duke of Marlborough who won it, and the generations of his family who lived in the house afterward. The specific contributions of a specific woman from New York are not on the tour. But the house is there, standing and maintained and open to the public, and some portion of the reason it is there in that condition has to do with a dowry negotiated in 1895 and the work of a 20-year-old woman who arrived in the English countryside in tears and stayed for 60 years and left something behind that outlasted everything she had felt. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. On the 1st of December 1919, a woman from Danville, Virginia walked into the House of Commons, took her oath, and sat down. Her name was Nancy Astor. She was 40 years old. She was the first woman 40 years old. She was the first woman to sit in the British Parliament, and she had arrived there by a route so improbable that even she, who had the confidence of a woman entirely comfortable with improbability, seems to have found it somewhat amusing. She had come to England as a divorced American socialite in 1903, and had married a very rich man and managed a very large house, and had, through the specific mechanism of her husband being elevated to the House of Lords, inherited his parliamentary seat and decided to stand for it. Nancy Langhorne had grown up in Virginia in a family whose fortunes had fluctuated dramatically after the Civil War. Her father had struggled and then succeeded in the railroad business, and the Langhorne sisters were legendary in their part of Virginia for their beauty, their wit, and the quality of their company, which had a warmth and directness that was specifically Southern American, in a way that distinguished them from the more calculated social performances of New York or Newport. Nancy was the fourth of the surviving sisters, and she had the fourth sister's particular combination of determination and charm, the sense of someone who has observed the social world carefully from a position slightly outside it and has decided she can manage it better than the people currently in charge. Her first marriage to Robert Gould Shaw of Boston was a disaster. He was a polo player with a drinking problem and a roving eye, and Nancy, who was 18 when she married him, and 19 when she first began to understand what she had married, responded with a dignity that impressed observers and a resolve that was entirely characteristic. They had one child, Robert Gould Shaw III, known as Bobby. They separated after 4 years and divorced in 1903. The divorce was not the end of her social life. It was, in an unexpected way, the beginning of the life she was actually suited for. She came to England with Bobby and her younger sister Phyllis in 1903, and she moved through English society with the ease of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this context without knowing it. She met Waldorf Astor at a house party. He was the heir to one of the largest fortunes in England, the son of William Waldorf Astor, the American-born financier who had concluded that England suited him better than America and had moved there permanently, eventually becoming Viscount Astor and one of the most significant figures in English public life. Waldorf was thoughtful and serious and besotted with Nancy from almost immediately, and she married him in 1906 with the sense of a woman who has finally found the situation that matches her capacities. Cliveden was the Astor country house in Buckinghamshire, an enormous Italianate pile on a bluff above the Thames, its grounds sweeping down toward the river in a series of terraces that became, under Nancy's management, one of the most beautiful and most frequented properties in England. The house was the gift of Waldorf's father, who presented it to the couple as a wedding present, with the calm munificence of a man for whom such gestures were simply appropriate. Nancy took Cliveden and turned it into something specific, a gathering place for the politically interesting and the culturally significant, a house where the conversation at dinner might include Winston Churchill and Henry Ford and Rudyard Kipling and Charlie Chaplin and Franklin Roosevelt on different occasions. She was a hostess of genius, which is a description that sounds diminishing and is not. The ability to manage a very large house with a very large staff and a very complicated calendar of guests who had in common only that they were significant in their various fields, to bring those people together in combinations that produced interesting conversation rather than polite noise, to manage the social temperature of a room in which political enemies might find themselves in adjacent chairs, to remember everyone's name and the names of their families and what they had said at the last visit. All of this requires a specific and rare intelligence, and Nancy Astor had it in abundance. When war came in 1914, Cliveden became a hospital. Nancy organised it herself, converting the ballroom and other rooms into wards, recruiting nursing staff, managing the supplies and the administration with the same efficiency she brought to peacetime hospitality. Waldorf sat in Parliament for Plymouth, and Nancy campaigned for him with the energy of a woman who found politics more interesting than anything else, which she did. When Waldorf's father died in 1919, and Waldorf inherited the title and was automatically elevated to the House of Lords, He turned to Nancy and suggested that she stand for the Plymouth seat he was vacating. Nancy, by some accounts, had not originally considered this possibility. She considered it now. The campaign for the Plymouth Sutton seat in 1919 was fought by Nancy Astor with the same combination of wit and directness she brought to everything else. She was not, as she later acknowledged, deeply versed in the policy details of the moment, but she was a woman of considerable rhetorical gift, and the specific kind of courage required to stand in a room of men who had decided you were an intrusion and make them listen anyway was something she possessed in full measure. Winston Churchill, who was not always her ally, told her that her intrusion into the House of Commons was as embarrassing as if she had burst into his bathroom when he had nothing to defend himself, not even a sponge. She told him he was not handsome enough to have worries of that kind. She won the seat on the 28th of November 1919. On the 1st of December she took her oath. She was the first woman to sit in the British Parliament, though not the first elected. Constance Markiewicz had been elected for an Irish constituency in 1918 but had refused, in line with Sinn Féin policy, to take her seat. Nancy Astor actually sat down, which seemed at the time both historically significant and slightly confrontational, which was more or less the combination she had been deploying her entire life. She held the Plymouth Sutton seat for 25 years until 1945. She was a Conservative member, which put her in alliance with people whose views she did not always share, and against people whose views she sometimes found more congenial. Her causes were temperance, women's welfare, children's welfare, and a general conviction that the moral dimension of public life deserved more attention than it was getting. She had converted to Christian Science in 1914, and her faith, combined with her Virginia upbringing's complex relationship with alcohol, made temperance not merely a policy position, but something close to a personal crusade. She was also, in her later years, associated with the Cliveden Set, the informal group of politicians and intellectuals who gathered at the House in the 1930s, and who were connected to the policy of appeasement toward Nazi Germany. This association damaged her reputation, and she was not fully rehabilitated from it before her death. She had been wrong about appeasement in ways that mattered enormously, and the record did not allow for much softening of that fact. She had also, it should be said, been right about a great many other things, and the balance of a political career is rarely simple. Nancy Astor died in 1964, at 84, at Grimsthorpe in Lincolnshire. She had been born in Danville, Virginia, and she had been, for 60 years, one of the most recognisable figures in British public life. Her accent had never fully become English. She retained the quality of directness and the warmth and the specific kind of humour that was characteristically Southern American, and England had experienced it for so long and to such effect that it had become, somehow, characteristic of her. The category she occupied at her death was entirely her own, American by birth, English by residence, Virginian in spirit, and the first woman from either country to sit in the British Parliament. The house on the bluff above the Thames, Cliveden, is a hotel now. People stay there on special weekends and walk the terraces where the great and the controversial and the occasionally merely famous walked for 50 years. In the rooms where the conversation once reached a specific quality of intelligence and conflict, guests now have dinner and look at the view and do not think, usually, about the woman from Danville who had arranged all of it with such visible satisfaction. Nancy Astor in Parliament was a different thing from Nancy Astor at Cliveden. At Cliveden she was in her domain, managing the conversation and the guest list and the flow of the weekend with the practiced skill of someone who had been doing it for 20 years. In Parliament she was a guest in someone else's domain, and the House made this clear in various ways, some subtle and some less so. The smoking room, where much of the real political business of the House of Commons was conducted between sessions, was closed to her. The bathrooms did not have adequate facilities for women. The chamber itself was arranged for the conduct of proceedings by men who had been doing it in essentially the same way for 300 years and who were not entirely sure what to do with a woman in their midst. She dealt with this in the only way she knew how, which was to be entirely herself and to be it with complete confidence. She dressed simply when she was in the House, in the dark suits that signalled she was there to work rather than to be looked at. She spoke from the back benches with a clarity and wit that the male members found, depending on their political disposition, either refreshing or infuriating. She had views and she stated them, and the views were not always predictable or aligned with the party line in ways that would have made her parliamentary career easier. Her causes, temperance above all, which she pursued with the single-mindedness of someone for whom it was not merely a policy, but a personal conviction rooted in her Virginia upbringing and her Christian Science faith. She successfully introduced legislation banning the sale of alcohol to persons under 18, the first private member's bill sponsored by a woman to become law. She worked across party lines with other women MPs, when there eventually were other women MPs, on legislation concerning women's welfare and children's welfare, and the conditions of women in employment. The question of what kind of feminist Nancy Astor was is a complicated one, because she was a woman of her time and class as well as a woman ahead of her time in important ways. She believed in women's equality in politics. She did not always believe in it in the economic or social sphere in the thoroughgoing way that a later generation would require. She had, by her own later reflection, been as good a feminist as anyone of her era, which is both true and a specific kind of true. Winston Churchill was her parliamentary sparring partner of choice, and their exchanges in the House were among the most entertaining political theatre of the 1920s and 1930s. They were both, in different ways, performers as much as politicians, people who understood that the ability to hold a room was a political tool, and who deployed it deliberately. Churchill found Astor's presence in the Commons uncomfortable in ways he made no attempt to disguise. She found his discomfort amusing in ways that are preserved in the exchange about the bathroom and the sponge, which she delivered with the timing of a woman who'd been waiting for exactly that opening. The Cliveden set controversy, the association with appeasement in the 1930s, complicated her legacy in ways that she spent her remaining years unable to fully rehabilitate. She had been wrong, as many people of her class and connection were wrong, about the possibility of accommodation with Nazi Germany. She had believed in the early 1930s that a negotiated arrangement was preferable to another European war, and this belief aligned her with people whose reasons for preferring peace were less defensible than hers. The war demonstrated the error. She did not hide from it, but she could not undo it. Her contribution to Plymouth, the constituency she represented for 25 years, was substantial and specific. She had taken a genuine interest in the welfare of the people who had elected her, attending to the concerns of working-class families in a port city with the same directness and wit she brought to the palace at Cliveden. The people of Plymouth had elected her, and then re-elected her, and then re-elected her again, which suggests that whatever her liabilities as a national political figure, she had been a useful local representative. In her old age, stripped of Cliveden and of her parliamentary seat, and of the specific social position that the House and the seat had sustained, Nancy Astor was diminished in a way that she found very difficult. She had been organised for 50 years around the management of large important things, and the removal of the large important things left her with energy that had nowhere to go. She became, in the accounts of people who knew her in her last years, sharper and less manageable than she had been when she had the outlet of work. She had always said difficult things. She was still saying difficult things. But without the context of authority and responsibility, the difficult things had a different quality. She died in 1964, the same year as Consuelo Vanderbilt, two women who had come from America to England in the last decades of the 19th century, who had built their lives there through considerable effort and considerable intelligence, died in the same year in the country they had made their own. Neither of them had become fully English. Both of them had become entirely something else, something that England had made of the specific American material they had brought with them, and that existed nowhere else quite in that form. Not all of them stayed. The 150 years since the height of the dollar princess phenomenon have tended to remember the women who remained in Europe and made something of themselves there, whose names appear in the history books and whose portraits hang in country houses. But for every Jenny Jerome Churchill who became an English institution, there was a woman whose story resolved itself more quietly, more painfully, in a return that brought her back to a home that had changed while she was gone. The letters these women sent back to their families in America have a particular quality in the years after the wedding and the installation in the great house. The first letters are often euphoric, written in the specific language of a young woman who has been placed in an extraordinary setting and is still processing the spectacle of it. The house is magnificent. The grounds are beautiful. The servants are well trained, and the dinners are elaborate, and the social calendar is very full. The letter is written by candlelight in a bedroom with a view of parkland that extends further than you can see. 6 months later, the letter sounds different. The house is still magnificent, but There is a particular quality to the magnificence that you were not warned about, which is that magnificence at scale requires constant management, and the management falls to you. The grounds are beautiful in the autumn, but the autumn has lasted longer than any autumn you have known before. Weeks of grey sky and wet grass, and the specific smell of damp stone that English country houses have from October through March. The social calendar is still full, but you have attended the same events with the same people in the same rooms, often enough now to have exhausted the novelty. A year after that, the letters from some of these women begin to include sentences that require a reader to pay careful attention to what is not being said. There are references to missing things that are not food or weather, references to conversations that cannot be had here in the way they could be had at home, references to a quality of ease that seems to have retreated to the other side of the Atlantic with the ship that brought you over. The homesickness that the mothers had assured their daughters would pass had not passed. It had become something more permanent, more like a condition than a feeling, a low specific ache that did not prevent you from functioning but was always there. The women who came back, who managed to divorce or to be widowed and to return to America, often found that home had not waited for them. America in 1910 was not America in 1895. The houses of their childhood had different furniture. The social landscape had rearranged itself around their absence. The girls who had been their friends were now women with established lives, established references, established habits of thought that had accumulated in their presence and in her absence, a gap that could not be bridged simply by arriving. She had a title now, if the marriage had survived long enough for the title to matter, and the title was interesting to Americans in the way that all things British were interesting to Americans, but it was interesting in the wrong way, as a curiosity rather than a credential. Some of them found that what they had been was not quite recoverable. They had gone to Europe as American girls, and they had returned as something that was neither American nor quite European, a specific in-between thing for which there was no name and no established social place. The accent had shifted, the references had become partially British, the habits of an English country house had replaced the habits of Newport and New York in ways that were invisible until they weren't. They had become, without meaning to, something new, and the country they came back to had not consulted them about the change. Consuelo Vanderbilt, who did eventually spend periods in America with her second husband, described in her memoir the specific strangeness of returning to Newport and Fifth Avenue after decades in England. The houses were familiar, the names were familiar, and yet there was a quality to the conversations, an angle of reference, an assumption about what mattered and what was merely background, that she no longer fully shared. She moved through American society as a distinguished visitor rather than a native, which was the reverse of what she had felt in her early years at Blenheim, and the reversal was not comfortable. There was also the question of money. The women who came back as divorcees faced a specific practical problem. The dowry, the great sum negotiated between the families before the wedding, had generally been settled on the husband at the time of marriage. In many cases it was gone, used to repair the roof or pay the debts or maintain the estate in the years of the marriage. Getting it back required legal action, and legal action required lawyers, and lawyers required time and money and the kind of sustained determination that was difficult to maintain when you were also managing the grief and exhaustion of a failed marriage in a country that was not yours. Some of them simply made new arrangements. They found houses in the south of France where the English and American expatriate communities had established a way of life that was neither one thing nor the other, Mediterranean in setting and climate, Anglo-American in its social codes, comfortable in the specific way of places designed for people who have decided not to commit fully to any particular nationality. The Riviera in the early 20th century was full of dollar princesses in various stages of recovery, women who had married into the English or French or Italian aristocracy and had emerged from those marriages with their money substantially diminished and their sense of themselves substantially enlarged. The ones who managed best in these in-between positions were usually the ones who had the fewest illusions to begin with, the daughters who had gone to Europe knowing exactly what the arrangement was and had made their peace with it early, or who had found within the arrangement something that sustained them. The charity work or the political engagement or the music or the painting tended to stay and to build something durable. The ones who had gone expecting the fairy tale and had found the draughty castle were the ones who most desperately wanted to come home. But home had changed, and they had changed, and the distance between those two changes was sometimes impossible to cross. A woman who had spent 20 years managing an English country house and organising a county's worth of charitable activities had developed capabilities that had no natural outlet in the social landscape she had left as a girl of 20. She was, in the fullest sense, a different person from the one who had stood at the ship railing watching the English coast emerge from the morning mist. She had been formed by the country she had gone to against her full consent, and that forming was, by a certain age, irreversible. This is perhaps the most honest account of what happened to these women. Not that they stayed because they wanted to stay, and not that they left because they wanted to leave, but that the question of wanting became, over years, more complicated than the simple geography of departure and return. They were shaped by the places that received them and the people they became in those places, and the shaping was not the shape they would have chosen, but it was, nonetheless, the shape they had. The ship back to New York left from Southampton. It took 10 days, and some of the women who stood at the railing watching England diminish behind them felt something they had not expected to feel, which was loss. Not for the cold houses or the managing husbands or the social codes that had required years to decode, but for the people they had become there, the work they had done there, the particular quality of themselves that had emerged in that specific cold and grey and formerly beautiful landscape. They had left something in England that was not the thing they had been sent to leave. They had left themselves, or a version of themselves, and they were taking the rest of it home. There were women who managed the transition back to America with considerable dignity, who found on their return that the life available to them was in some ways richer than the one they had left. The American women who returned as titled divorcees occupied a specific social position in the first decades of the 20th century that was complicated but not without its advantages. They had the title, which was interesting to Americans. They had the experience, which made them socially formidable. They had the freedom, if the settlement was adequate, to do whatever they chose. Some of them chose to write. The memoir was a natural form for women of this generation, who had had experiences that no one else had had in quite the same way, and who had reached, in their 50s and 60s, the age at which the privacy that had governed their lives began to feel less necessary than the record. They wrote with varying degrees of candour, depending on who was still alive and what the legal situation was and how much they cared, at that point in their lives, about the reactions of people they had not seen in 30 years. Consuelo Vanderbilt's memoir was the most candid of the lot, and it was the most candid in part because she waited until she was in her 70s to write it, until the Duke was dead, and most of the people who might have felt implicated were gone. The Glitter and the Gold is a document of considerable historical value precisely because it was written by someone who had been inside the system, rather than observing it from outside, who could describe not only what happened but what it felt like from within the specific and demanding position of being an heiress in an English duke's household. The women who did not write, who managed the return to America or the continued residence in Europe without leaving a record beyond the social pages and the family letters, are harder to know. Their experience of the transition is recoverable only in fragments, in the occasional reference in someone else's memoir or in the deposition of a lawyer who had to sort out the financial arrangements after a divorce. Some of them were simply quiet, and their quietness is itself a kind of statement about what the experience had been, about how little of it could be said in the available language. Anna Gould, one of the Jay Gould daughters, was among the more dramatic of the women who attempted to extract herself from a bad European marriage. She had married the Comte de Castellane in 1895 and had spent the next decade watching him spend her money, which he did with the enthusiasm of a man who had spent his entire life waiting for access to this particular kind of resource. He spent approximately $10 million of Anna Gould's fortune in a decade, on parties and houses and horses and the kind of social magnificence that Paris in the Belle Époque considered appropriate for a man of his position and his wife's resources. Anna divorced him in 1906, a process that required years and considerable legal effort and the specific persistence of a woman who had decided that enough was enough, and that no social consideration was worth what she was paying for it. She then married the Duc de Talleyrand-Périgord, her first husband's cousin, which seemed to her contemporaries either admirably pragmatic or slightly unhinged, depending on their point of view. She remained in France for the rest of her life, more or less. The return to America that a divorce might have suggested was not for her the obvious next step. This was true for many of the women who exited their first European marriages. The exit was not always back across the Atlantic. Some of them moved sideways, from one European arrangement to another, from the English house to the French villa, from the bad husband to the more suitable husband, or simply from the formal requirements of a titled marriage to the informal freedom of a wealthy woman in a European city with no particular obligations to anyone. Paris, in particular, was full of wealthy American women in the early decades of the 20th century who had come to Europe in various capacities and had found that Europe, for all its difficulties, offered a kind of life that America did not. The freedom available to a wealthy woman in Paris was different from the freedom available to a wealthy woman in New York or Newport. It was not more complete, but it was more various. The specific social rules were different, and the different rules had different exclusions and different permissions, and a woman who had been shaped by the English system could sometimes find more room in the French one, or could create room that simply did not exist in the tighter social architecture she had started from. Some of them had no intention of returning to America because America, for them, had ceased to be a live option long before they were in a position to consider it. The woman who arrives at 20 and stays for 30 years is not the same woman who left. The country she came from has changed. The people who made up her world there have their own lives, their own accumulated history that she is not part of. The return would require the construction of an entirely new life, in a country that was familiar in memory and foreign in fact, and the energy required for that construction was not always available. The roofs came first. That is perhaps the most concrete way to understand what American money did to England in the final decades of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th. It fixed the roofs. The great country houses of the English aristocracy had been leaking, many of them, for years. The agricultural depression of the 1870s had reduced the income from the land that supported these houses, and the houses themselves, built on a scale that required constant and expensive maintenance, had been quietly deteriorating. The slate on the roofs needed replacing. The lead guttering needed work. The stone was cracking in the corners where water had been getting in for decades. Blenheim Palace, when Consuelo Vanderbilt arrived as its new Duchess in 1895, was a house in serious physical trouble beneath its magnificence. The Vanderbilt money that came with her did not go to jewels or wardrobes. It went into the fabric of the building, roof repairs, new plumbing, the renovation of the staterooms and the installation of some of the comforts that Consuelo had grown up taking for granted in American houses. The Duke supervised the restoration with the attention of a man who's been waiting his entire adult life for the financial means to do what he has always known needed doing. The palace that visitors see today, its great hall, and its long library and its painted ceilings, owes its current state in significant part to the railroad fortune of William Kissam Vanderbilt. At Kedleston Hall in Derbyshire, the Curzon family seat that Mary Lita Curzon came to when she married George Curzon, the situation was similar. The house was one of Robert Adams' masterpieces, a neoclassical building of extraordinary architectural distinction, but it was a house that had been designed for a level of income that its 20th century inhabitants did not have. Mary's dowry and the income from her father's estate in Chicago went into maintaining the house and funding the lifestyle of a man whose political career required a London presence as well as a country one. The later money that disappeared into the management of George Curzon's obligations helped ensure that Kedleston remained what it was, a complete and maintained example of English neoclassical architecture rather than a partly ruined shell. The pattern repeated itself across England and across Scotland and Wales and Ireland too. American money flowed into hundreds of houses in the years of the dollar princess marriages, paying for renovations and repairs and the installation of modern conveniences in houses that had been managing without them for centuries. Some of these houses had been open to the public on certain days of the week, a practice that had begun as a form of income and had evolved into something more complicated, the English aristocracy's complicated relationship with the idea of being observed by the people who farmed their land and worked in their factories, and came on summer Saturdays to look at the pictures. The aesthetic impact was not only structural. The American women who came to these houses brought with them a sensibility that was, in many cases, significantly more modern than the English sensibility they were marrying into. American houses of the 1880s and 1890s were furnished according to a different aesthetic than English country houses, more open to new things, less devoted to the accumulated objects of previous generations simply on the grounds that they had accumulated. When a new American duchess looked at the drawing room of her inherited house and found it dark and over-furnished, and arranged according to principles that had not been revised since 1870, she was likely to propose changes. The English servants and the English husbands and the English guests were sometimes receptive to these proposals and sometimes not. The renovation of Sunderland House in Mayfair, which William Vanderbilt built for Consuelo as a London residence, was an example of American money applied to English social infrastructure, with a result that was widely admired. The house was elegant and modern and equipped with every convenience, and it became one of the significant addresses in Edwardian London, a house where political and social gatherings could be conducted with a comfort and efficiency that older London houses did not always offer. Beyond the houses, the American money went into the landscapes. The great gardens of the English country house had been maintained for centuries on the labour of gardening staff and the investment of owners who understood gardens as part of the statement their property made about them. When income declined in the 1870s and 1880s, gardens were often the first thing to be reduced, the most expensive staff let go, the most elaborate features allowed to run to seed. American money, where it was available, reversed this. The gardens were restored, the glass houses were rebuilt, the formal beds were replanted with the seasonal precision that required considerable staff and considerable investment. In France, the dollar princess phenomenon operated differently but with similar structural effect. French noble families, less land-rich than the English, but often encumbered with their own versions of the crumbling chateau problem, discovered American heiresses with the same practical interest that the English had. The difference was that French society's relationship with American wealth was somewhat more accepting, or at least somewhat less openly contemptuous. France had a tradition of marrying money from anywhere it was available, and the specific snobbery that English aristocracy brought to the question of American origins was less pronounced in French social circles. Winneretta Singer's mansion on Avenue Henri Martin, renovated and furnished with the resources of the Singer sewing machine fortune, became one of the most beautiful private houses in Paris, its music room specifically designed to accommodate the performances that made the Polignac Salon what it was. She had spent considerable amounts of money making it exactly right, and exactly right in this case meant acoustically correct as well as aesthetically satisfying, a room where sound behaved as music required, and where the lighting and the furniture and the arrangement of chairs created the conditions under which serious listening was possible. The physical legacy of the dollar princess marriages is still present in the English countryside, though it is not always identified as such. Houses that might have fallen into dereliction or been demolished in the early 20th century are standing because an American heiress's dowry went into their fabric in the 1890s. Gardens that might have been simplified into manageability are elaborate because a railroad magnate's daughter thought they should be. The English countryside's particular quality of maintained magnificence, the sense of a landscape actively tended to a high standard across generations, owes more to American money than most of its custodians are likely to mention. There is something quietly ironic in this. The aristocratic families who received American heiresses with varying degrees of condescension, who treated their American accents and American habits and American references as the disadvantages of an unfortunate origin, were living in houses sustained by American capital. The roof that did not leak, the boiler that worked, the plumbing that delivered hot water to the bathroom, all of this was there because someone's father had made money in railroads or retail or oil in a country that the English regarded as newer and therefore less. The Americans, for their part, had acquired through these marriages a connection to the English landscape that was not purely transactional. The women who spent decades in these houses, who managed their households and their estates, and their tenants and their guests, developed a relationship with the English countryside that was genuine and in some cases very deep. They knew the specific quality of English light in different seasons. They knew the sound of rooks in the elms at dusk and the smell of cut grass in a June that came late and went quickly. They knew, in the cellular way that only long familiarity creates, exactly what place felt like from the inside. The money had come from one world and had been spent in another, and what it had built beyond the repaired roofs and the restored gardens was a population of women who belonged fully and specifically to both. Highclere Castle in Hampshire, known today as the filming location for Downton Abbey, is another house whose survival owes something to an American heiress. Lady Almina, who married the 5th Earl of Carnarvon in 1895, was the illegitimate daughter of Alfred de Rothschild and brought to the marriage a substantial fortune that was used to pay off the estate's debts and restore the house to the condition that the fictional Crawley family inhabit in the television series. The television series is set in the Edwardian era, the same era in which the real Lady Almina was converting the castle into a hospital during the First World War and nursing wounded soldiers with the practical energy that American wives brought to most of the situations they encountered. The relationship between the American money and the English houses was not always frictionless. The English families who received the money were sometimes deeply grateful and sometimes resentful in the complicated way of people who need something very much and are not entirely comfortable with needing it. The American women who brought the money were sometimes practical about what they were purchasing and sometimes had genuinely hoped for something more than a restoration project. The tension between what was purchased and what was hoped for runs through the histories of most of these marriages. The English nobleman who accepted the American wife and her dowry had got what he needed for his estate. The American heiress who accepted the English nobleman and his title had got what her mother had sent her for. Neither party had necessarily got what they had wanted in the deeper and less manageable sense of the word want, and the gap between what was transacted and what was desired was the space in which most of these marriages lived. The houses absorbed the money and remained the houses they had always been, which was perhaps the most honest thing about them. Blenheim was Blenheim before the Vanderbilt money arrived, and it was Blenheim after, better maintained and with more reliable plumbing, but in its essential character unchanged. The Vanderbilt money had not made it American. It had made it more completely itself. This is, in the final accounting, what money usually does to old things. It allows them to continue being what they are, which may or may not be what you hoped for when you arrived with the checkbook. The gardens tell a different story. The great English gardens that were restored or extended or maintained by American money in this period bear the marks of the women who managed them in ways that are still legible if you know what to look for. Mary Lita Curzon's influence on the gardens at Kedleston is documented in the head gardener's records, which show the varieties of plants that were introduced during her tenure and which remain in the beds today. Consuelo Vanderbilt's influence on the Blenheim Gardens is more diffuse but present in the organisation of the walled kitchen garden and in the planting of the pleasure grounds that she oversaw during her years as Duchess. The kitchen gardens of these houses were productive landscapes of considerable sophistication. A kitchen garden of the scale required to supply a house like Blenheim or Kedleston, with its household staff and its frequent house parties, and its regular large dinners, was essentially a small farm, managed with the precision of an agricultural operation, rather than the casualness of a domestic garden. It had its own workforce, its own seasonal schedule, its own logic of what was planted when and harvested when and stored how. The American women who engaged with their kitchen gardens were engaging with the most practical dimension of the English country house, the dimension that was least about performance and most about the actual sustaining of life. The produce that came out of the kitchen garden appeared on the dinner table in the form of vegetables and fruit and herbs, present in every meal but invisible as work, part of the background of the house's operation that was managed below the level of the guest's attention. Below that level, in the actual kitchen, the American mistress and the English cook sometimes arrived at something that could not quite be called friendship, but was its own form of understanding, a mutual recognition of competence across a very large social distance. The cook knew what the kitchen could do and could not do. The mistress knew what the table needed. The negotiation between these two knowledge sets, conducted through menus and morning conferences and the occasional gentle suggestion, produced the food that appeared at dinner, and that guests remembered long after they had forgotten the conversation. The physical legacy in France is less concentrated than in England, partly because the French aristocracy managed its relationship with American money differently, and partly because the French country house, the chateau, had different structural vulnerabilities than the English country house. But in Paris, the legacy of the American women who made their homes there is legible in the buildings and the institutions they funded. Winnaretta Singer's mansion on Avenue Georges Mondel still stands. The Fondation Singer-Polignac still operates, commissioning music and sponsoring research and maintaining the connection between the American sewing machine fortune and the European cultural world that its heiress had decided was the most interesting thing to spend it on. The summer of 1914 in England was very beautiful. People who were alive then and who wrote about it later described it with a specific quality of emphasis, as though they were trying to fix it in memory against what came after. The gardens were full, the house parties were full, the great summer entertainments of the Edwardian social season, Ascot and Henley and the endless rounds of country house visits were proceeding on their customary schedule with the customary magnificence. The American heiresses who had been in England for 10 or 20 years were as English as they were going to become. Their children growing up in these houses with accents that gave nothing away, their friendships and their obligations woven through the fabric of English society so completely that the fabric and they were no longer separable. Then, August came, and everything changed. The world that had sustained the dollar princess marriages, the world of the great English house and the elaborate social season and the assumption of a certain kind of permanence, ended in August of 1914 in a way that nobody who was living in it had understood as possible. The war that began that month would kill 1 million Englishmen in the next 4 years, and would kill the specific England those men had come from, in a more diffuse and permanent way that took longer to recognise but was equally final. The country houses became hospitals. Cliveden, where Nancy Astor was installed, was converted with her characteristic efficiency into a ward for wounded soldiers, its ballroom turned over to rows of beds, its grounds used for rehabilitation. Blenheim was similarly converted. The great houses of the English countryside, designed for the entertainment of the comfortable, found a different use, and their American owners, who had learned in England a particular kind of practical competence, managed the conversions with the energy that managing things had always required. Jenny Jerome Churchill, who was 60 when the war began and had by that point been an English institution for 4 decades, continued to operate in the wartime social and political world with the same forward motion that had characterised everything she did. Her son Winston, now 40, was First Lord of the Admiralty, and would go on through the convulsions of the war and the subsequent decades to become the defining figure of his century. The American energy that Jenny had brought to England in 1873 had, through the specific alchemy of genes and upbringing and the particular circumstances of a brilliant man's formation, become the energy that held England together in its darkest years. Mary Leiter Curzon was already dead by 1914, gone at 36 in 1906, her 3 daughters growing up at Kedleston and in London, under the management of a father who was, by all accounts, devoted to them, and who managed his grief in the English way, through activity and public service, and a quality of controlled melancholy that became the note on which his extraordinary career ended. Her daughters married into the English aristocracy in turn, following the same pattern their mother had established, the American money flowing into the next generation of English houses through channels that had become, by that point, familiar. The war changed the social arithmetic of the dollar princess marriages in ways that took years to become clear. The Englishmen who had married American money were, in many cases, the same generation as the men who died in the trenches of the Western Front. The inheritance patterns of the English aristocracy, already complicated by death duties, became more complicated by a generation of heirs who did not survive to inherit. Houses that had been restored with American dowries passed to distant relatives or came to the end of their family lines entirely. The social world that had created the demand for American heiresses in the first place was quietly reorganizing itself around the absence of the generation that had conducted most of the original transactions. What survived the war, in the houses that survived it, was something that looked like continuity but was not quite the same thing. The drawing rooms were the same drawing rooms, the names were the same names. The rituals of the English country house continued because they were designed for continuity and were very good at it. But the specific quality of the pre-war world, the unexamined confidence in its own permanence, was gone. The houses that Consuelo Vanderbilt and Mary Leiter Curzon and Jenny Jerome Churchill and their contemporaries had helped to sustain were now occupied by people who understood, in a way their predecessors had not, that the thing they were maintaining was not permanent, but was instead a form of act of will against the evidence. Nancy Astor's Cliveden became, in the 1920s and 1930s, the centre of a different kind of English social world, one that was more self-consciously political and more anxious than the pre-war version. The Cliveden set, as it was eventually called by critics, gathered at the house to discuss the political situation of the 1930s and arrived at conclusions that subsequent history would judge harshly. The house that had been a place of social magnificence became a place of political consequence, which is in some ways a measure of how seriously Nancy Astor had managed it, and in other ways a measure of how seriously she had erred in the company she kept and the ideas she entertained. Winnaretta Singer, in Paris, navigated the war with the practicality she brought to everything. The salon was suspended during the years of active conflict. The musicians and writers who had gathered in her rooms were dispersed to other concerns. She devoted energy and money to social relief work, to the housing projects she'd been engaged with since 1911, to the kind of practical assistance to people whose lives had been disrupted. That was the counterweight to the salon's cultural work. After the war, the salon resumed, and the 1920s and 1930s saw it continue to function as one of the few genuinely consistent places of musical patronage in Europe. The Edwardian afternoon, the long warm summer of the pre-war social world, did end in August of 1914. But the women who had been living in it did not end with it. They adapted, as women of their type tend to adapt, with a pragmatism that is sometimes mistaken for coldness, and is actually the furthest thing from it. They had crossed an ocean once and had built a life on the other side, and the destruction of the specific world they had built it in was not, for most of them, enough to make them cross back. They had become European in the most permanent sense, the sense in which identity is shaped by years of inhabiting a specific place and being shaped by it in return. The war had changed the place, but the years before the war had changed the women, and the changed women and the changed place continued together into whatever came next. The house parties of the 1920s were smaller than the house parties of the 1900s. The guest lists had gaps in them that were never filled. The social world that reassembled itself after 1918 was recognisably the same world and was fundamentally different. The way a person who has survived something serious is recognisably the same person, and is, in some quality that cannot be located precisely, not quite who they were before. The American women who were still in England in the 1920s had spent decades there by that point. They had come as girls, and they were now in their 40s and 50s, and the England they were living in was not the England they had arrived in, and the women they were not the women who had arrived. The crossing had been completed in some way deeper than geography a long time ago. This was home now, in the specific and irreversible sense of the word, that means not the place you came from, but the place you have become. The specific experience of the women who managed country houses during the First World War is one of the less documented aspects of the home front. The hospitals set up in country houses were not official military institutions but voluntary operations, funded and managed by the owners and staffed by a combination of professional nurses and volunteers. The conversion of a ballroom into a ward required practical intelligence of a kind that had nothing to do with social precedent, and everything to do with the question of how you keep people alive when the usual systems have been redirected elsewhere. Nancy Astor managed the Cliveden Hospital through both world wars with the same directness she brought to parliamentary business. She visited the wards, she spoke to the patients, she arranged outings and entertainments for those well enough to leave their beds. She wrote letters for those who were not. She treated the wounded men as the constituents they were, the same working-class men of Plymouth and the surrounding areas whose welfare she had been attending to since her husband first stood for Parliament, now returned to her care in a more literal sense than political representation usually requires. The men who came through those wards came from the same communities that had sent their rents to the owners of these houses for generations. The social distance between the wounded soldier lying in a bed in what had been the Cliveden ballroom and the Viscountess who came to see him was absolute by the standards of 1915. What Nancy Astor brought to it was something that crossed the distance, not by pretending it wasn't there, but by simply not allowing it to prevent the human transaction. She looked at the man, she asked his name, she listened to what he said. After the war, the houses that had been hospitals were restored to their pre-war function, and the pre-war function of these houses was the social function, the hosting of the events and the people and the conversations through which the English upper class reproduced and maintained itself. But the restoration was never complete, because the people who were supposed to inhabit the restored world were not all there. The men who had died in the war left specific absences in specific families and specific houses, and the women who continued were managing those absences alongside everything else. The children of these American women had in many cases served in the war. Consuelo's sons, John and Ivor Spencer Churchill, were both young men during the First World War. The fact that both survived it was not something that could be assumed in advance, and the specific quality of relief that their mother must have felt when the war ended was the relief of a woman who had spent 4 years knowing that the world she'd given her sons to might destroy them. By the time the Second World War came, In 1939, most of the original dollar princesses were very old women. Jenny Jerome Churchill had been dead for 18 years. Mary Lita Curzon for 33. The ones who were still alive, Consuelo and Nancy and Winnaretta, were in their 60s. The world was unravelling for the second time in a generation, and they watched it happen from the perspective of people who had seen it happen once before, and had survived the first unravelling and were not entirely sure about the second. The daughters of the dollar princesses grew up in the houses their mothers had married into, and they grew up as English children, with English accents and English educations and English assumptions about the world and their place in it. They grew up knowing that their mothers had come from somewhere else, that the source of the family's financial security was a grandfather or great-grandfather in Chicago or New York. But this knowledge was background rather than foreground, a fact of family history rather than a present identity. They were the children of women who had crossed an ocean and stayed, and the crossing was not theirs to make. Mary Curzon's 3 daughters, born in India and in England in the years of their parents' marriage, grew up at Kedleston after their mother's death in 1906 under the care of a father who was, in his complicated and demanding way, devoted to them. Irene, Cynthia, and Alexandra Curzon all married into the English aristocracy in turn, continuing the pattern that had brought their American mother to Kedleston in the first place. The later money that had restored the family's finances in 1895 was, by the time of the daughters' marriages in the 1920s, thoroughly absorbed into the fabric of an English aristocratic family. Cynthia Curzon, the middle daughter, married Oswald Mosley, who would become one of the most troubling political figures of 20th century England, the leader of the British Union of Fascists. Her early death in 1933, at 34, before Mosley's politics became what they became, meant she was spared the specific grief of that knowledge. She had her mother's beauty and, by accounts, something of her mother's quality of natural grace. She died young, as her mother had died young, and the coincidence of age and circumstances carried a weight that those who knew both women felt as something beyond ordinary sadness. Consuelo Vanderbilt Marlborough's 2 sons, John and Ivor Spencer Churchill, grew up at Blenheim as the sons of a duke and an American heiress, and they grew up English in every observable way. John became the 10th Duke of Marlborough and managed the palace for the middle decades of the 20th century with the attention of a man who had grown up inside the responsibility. The American strand in their heritage was there in the family tree, in the papers of their mother's memoir, in the specific source of the money that had made Blenheim what it was. But it was there as history, not as present identity. Winston Churchill, Jenny Jerome's son, was perhaps the most consequential child of the dollar princess marriages. He was half American by blood and he knew it, and he was, at various points in his career, useful about it, deploying his American heritage as a bridge between the two countries in ways that were both genuine and strategic. His mother had never gone back, and in that sense Winston Churchill was something new. Not an American transplanted to England, not an Englishman who happened to have American relatives, but the first of a generation for whom the crossing was not a story, but a fact of birth. The things these women passed on were not only genetic, they passed on a specific relationship to work and to practical intelligence that was characteristically American, in a way that their children absorbed without necessarily naming it. The English aristocracy's relationship with work was complicated, governed by the assumption that a certain class of person did not work in the ordinary sense, but instead managed, which was something different and more distinguished. The American heiresses who had grown up in families where their fathers had built things from scratch brought a different assumption, that the building of things was itself respectable, and their children absorbed some of this. Nancy Astor's children, the 6 she had with Waldorf, grew up at Cliveden in an atmosphere of unusual engagement with the world. Their mother's political involvement, her visitors, her causes, her absolute refusal to treat public affairs as something that happened elsewhere, created a household that was animated in a way that many English country houses were not. The children knew politicians and writers and reformers. They knew that their mother had a seat in Parliament, and that she went there and said things that mattered. This was not a common childhood in the English aristocracy, and it was not a coincidence that it was an American who created it. The charitable traditions that the dollar princesses established in their English counties were often continued after their deaths, by the organisations they had founded or by women they had trained in the work. Consuelo's work with women and children in Oxfordshire created structures that outlasted her. The hospitals that Nancy Astor helped organise at Cliveden during both World Wars left institutional residues in Plymouth and Buckinghamshire. Mary Leiter Curzon's brief tenure as Viceroy of India left a legacy of policies and approaches toward the Indian population that was noted by those who followed her in the role. The physical legacy is still visible, as noted in the houses, but there is also a less visible legacy in the way that certain English institutions and certain English families carry, embedded in their histories, the specific contribution of a woman from New York or Chicago or Virginia who arrived in the 1890s with a large dowry and a very developed sense of what she expected to do with her life. That woman's energy and practicality and refusal to be merely decorative shaped the household she managed, and the people who grew up in those households, and those people shaped others, in the long chain of influence that makes tracing any single contribution to the present impossible. The daughters of the dollar princesses grew up English, and their daughters grew up English, and the American quality of their grandmothers and great-grandmothers became, over generations, a note in the family history rather than a characteristic of the family present. The country houses remained, or many of them did. The names remained. The portraits remained, often including the portrait of the American grandmother in her Worth gown, the painting that had arrived in the house with the woman and that would be there after the woman was gone. What the women themselves would have thought of this legacy is difficult to know. Some of them, like Consuelo, had the opportunity to write about their own lives and to make explicit what they thought they had done and what it had cost them. Others left only the evidence of their actions and the impressions of people who knew them. What seems clear, from the accumulation of the evidence, is that most of them did not think of themselves primarily as the daughters of New York railroad magnates who had been sent to England to fix the roofs and prop up the peerage. They thought of themselves as people who had chosen a life, or had had a life chosen for them, and who had proceeded to live it with whatever resources were available. The resources were often considerable. The intelligence was usually very good. The will was, in most cases, remarkable, and the place they had come to, cold and grey and formal and magnificent, had shaped them in ways they could not have predicted and had given them, in exchange for what they had brought, something that no amount of American money could have purchased directly. The specific, irreplaceable and permanent sense of having been somewhere fully, of having belonged to a place in the way that only time and work and loss can create. They had gone to Europe for titles and had stayed for reasons that had nothing to do with titles, and the lives they had built there were their own, finally in the way that lives accumulated through choice and struggle, and the gradual discovery of what you actually are always, irreversibly your own. The story of what American money meant to the English aristocracy in the Gilded Age is usually told as a story of rescue, of English estates saved from ruin by the infusion of New World capital, and this telling is accurate as far as it goes, but it misses something. The women who brought the money were not merely vehicles for capital. They brought with them a set of attitudes toward work and possibility, and the limits of convention that were distinctively American, and those attitudes shaped the households they managed and the children they raised. The English country house of 1920 was a different institution from the English country house of 1890, in ways that had nothing to do with the war alone. It was different because it had been managed in many cases by American women who believed that things could be done differently and who acted on that belief. The charitable work that had expanded in Oxfordshire and Berkshire and the other counties where American duchesses managed estates was there because someone had decided it mattered. The hospital at Cliveden was there because someone had the organisational capacity to make it happen. The menus at certain dinner tables in England were better than they had been, because someone had an interest in food that went beyond the social performance of serving it. The children absorbed this, not as a lesson, not as explicit instruction, but as the atmosphere of a household where certain things were possible because someone was doing them. They grew up knowing that their mother went to meetings and served on committees and visited the poor and spoke in public and was taken seriously when she did these things. This knowing shaped what they thought was possible for themselves and for others, in ways that a later generation would describe as feminism and a contemporary would not have named at all. The granddaughters of the dollar princesses grew up in England in the 1920s and 1930s as members of a class and a country that was itself in transition, the slow dissolution of the Victorian social order continuing through the interwar years. Many of them went to university, a possibility that had not been available to their grandmothers. Some of them entered the professions. Some of them did not marry at all, or did not marry young, or married people from different classes and different backgrounds with a freedom that would have been effectively impossible for their grandmothers. The specific trajectory of Cynthia Curzon Mosley is among the more painful of these stories. She was Mary Lita Curzon's middle daughter, born in India in 1898, and she inherited from her mother's side the striking looks that ran through the later women and the quality of intelligence that Mary had possessed in such abundance. She married Oswald Mosley in 1920, when he was a promising young Conservative politician who would go on, in the 1930s, to found the British Union of Fascists and become the most prominent English advocate of the ideology that was in the process of destroying Europe. Cynthia died in 1933 at 34, before the full extent of where her husband was heading became clear. It is one of the few genuinely merciful things in this story. Alexandra Curzon, the youngest daughter, married Edward Metcalfe, who was one of the closest friends of Edward, Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, who abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson. Alexandra Metcalfe was a figure in the social world of the late 1930s that intersected at various points with the Windsors and the Appeasers and the complicated social politics of that period. The American thread in her ancestry was there in her family tree and in the social mobility that it had made possible, though she would not have described it in those terms. Irene Curzon, the eldest daughter, became Baroness Ravensdale and was active in English public life for decades, sitting in the House of Lords and working on social issues in the tradition of the charitable engagement her mother had modelled. She was the closest of the three daughters to the specific kind of public work that Mary Lita Curzon had done in India and in England, and the connection to her mother's example was something she acknowledged. These women, the daughters and granddaughters of the dollar princesses, are the least visible part of the story. They were there from the beginning, growing up in the houses their mothers had married into, inheriting the specific mixture of American money and English title, and the cultural space between the two that their parents had created. They were the first generation for whom that space was simply given rather than constructed, the first for whom being both American by origin and English by formation was not a novelty but a background fact. They carried the story forward into the 20th century in ways that are still, if you trace the lineages carefully enough, present in the present. The letters are what remain when so much else is gone. The houses are mostly still standing, many of them, though some are hotels now and others are divided into flats, and others have been transferred to the National Trust and open to the public on a fee-paying basis. The portraits are in the houses or in the museums. The official records are in the archives, but the letters, the private ones, the ones written late at night by the light of a fire that had almost gone out, to mothers and sisters and old friends in America who were too far away to visit, carry something that the official record does not. Consuelo Vanderbilt's letters from the early years of her marriage at Blenheim describe, with a careful indirection that suggests a woman who knows her correspondence might be read, a life that is very full and very managed. The household details are precise. The social calendar is precisely reported. The children's development is noted with the attention of a devoted mother. And beneath all of this, in the spaces between the sentences that report what happened and what was decided and what was required, there is a quality that readers have described as sadness, but that might be more precisely characterized as distance, a sense of a person writing from a great height above her own life, observing it with accuracy but not inhabiting it with warmth. The letters Jenny Jerome Churchill wrote from England in the early years of her marriage are different in character. They have a quality of energy that does not translate as happiness exactly, but as engagement, a woman who has found the world interesting and is proceeding through it at a pace that leaves no room for the kind of reflection that might produce sadness. She writes about politics and parties and the Prince of Wales and the state of Lord Randolph's political fortunes with the same urgent interest. She writes home less than many of her contemporaries, which is perhaps its own kind of statement. The distance from New York was not for Jenny, a wound that required constant attention. Mary Lita Curzon's letters from India have a quality that is different from both. She was a woman who loved her husband in a way that was entirely clear from her correspondence, and the letters to George during his absences on official travel, and the letters to her family in Chicago describing her life at Government House in Calcutta, have a warmth and directness that suggest a woman who is, in the fullest sense, present in her own life. She describes the heat and the ceremony and the people she meets and the conditions she finds on her visits to rural areas with the same thorough attention. She is tired, often, in the letters of the later years. The fatigue is there in the handwriting and in the frequency of references to her health, and in the particular quality of determination she brings to descriptions of continuing to do what she is supposed to do. The letters that did not survive are in some ways as interesting as the ones that did. Many of the women in this story were careful about what they committed to paper, knowing or at least sensing that their correspondence might eventually be read by people beyond its intended recipients. The specific thing they were most careful about usually was the marriage itself, the private quality of the relationship with the husband, the actual emotional content of the arrangement they were living inside. The practical details could be reported, the social calendar could be described, the children's progress could be noted with pride. But the question of whether they were happy, the direct answer to that question, is almost never in the letters. Happiness was not, in the social world these women inhabited, a thing you reported to your family by post. It was not a subject that was discussed with the directness that would make the question answerable in a letter. The assumption was that if you were managing well, if the children were healthy and the household was running and the social obligations were being met, you were doing what you were supposed to do, and doing what you were supposed to do was the closest available approximation to the thing you wanted to call happiness. Some of them kept diaries. The diaries that have survived are largely domestic documents, recording the same information as the letters, but in a slightly more compressed form, the lists of visitors and the weather and the meals served at significant dinners. The emotional content of the diaries is only marginally more available than the emotional content of the letters. These were not women who had been educated to examine their own feelings, with the kind of sustained introspective attention that a Victorian novel might lead you to expect. They had been educated to manage, and managing was the register in which they most naturally operated. But the dreams were not so easily managed. Several of the dollar princesses, writing late in their lives, mentioned dreams that had occurred throughout their years in England, recurring images of America in a specific and vivid quality, the particular light of a September afternoon in Newport, the smell of a specific room in a childhood house, the sound of a conversation in American English without the English social overlay that was present in everything they heard in England. These dreams are described with a tender precision that is entirely absent from the waking accounts of the same period. The dream America was more vivid than the real England, which may be what the unconscious does with things that cannot be processed in waking life. The homesickness, when it appeared directly in the record, was handled with the same management that everything else was handled with. It was acknowledged, briefly, and then absorbed back into the structure of the day. There were things to attend to. There was correspondence to manage and household decisions to make, and children to oversee and guests to receive. The specific ache of a Sunday afternoon in England when the light was going at 3 o'clock and the fire was making the particular sound of a fire in an English grate, and everything around you was correct and cold, and you could not quite remember what it had felt like to be entirely at home. That ache did not appear in the official record, but it was there, in the letters, in the silences between the letters, in the quality of the handwriting on evenings when the writing was slower and the sentences shorter. The night world of these women was the one that the history books do not contain. The parties and the charities and the parliamentary speeches and the salon evenings and the restoration of the palaces and the management of the households and the raising of the children, all of that is documented and recoverable. But the actual interior experience of lying in an English bedroom on a November night with the wind coming off the park and the fire almost out, and the particular quality of silence that England has at 3 a.m, an absolute silence that has been absolute for 1,000 years, that experience belongs to the woman who had it and is not recoverable. What we can say is that they stayed, the ones who could have left and did not, the ones who built their lives in the cold houses and managed them through the long English winters and the 2 world wars and the gradual social transformation of the world they had married into. They stayed because something about the staying was, in the end, more compelling than whatever leaving might have offered. This is not nothing. It is, in fact, the most important thing. They chose this. Or they chose it as much as any of us choose anything, in the accumulated weight of daily decisions that add up eventually to a life. The letters are in the archives now, in boxes in country house libraries, and in the special collections of universities on both sides of the Atlantic. They are read by researchers who are trying to understand what happened when a generation of American women crossed an ocean and built their lives in a country that was not theirs. The researchers read the careful sentences and note the careful silences and write their careful analyses. but the actual experience of writing the letters, the late hour and the firelight, and the particular quality of missing something you could not quite name, that is not recoverable. It is simply there, in the slight unevenness of the handwriting, in the letter that trails off before it is finished, in the fact that some of the letters were written and never sent. The specific quality of missing home that these women describe when they describe it at all is not simple nostalgia. It is something more complicated, something that includes nostalgia, but extends beyond it into a philosophical register. What they missed was not only America. They missed the version of themselves that had existed in America, the girl who had grown up in the specific house, in the specific city with the specific family around her, before the crossing, before the new name, before the English house and the English seasons and the English social codes that had gradually, irresistibly reshaped everything. That earlier self was not better than the self they had become. The self they had become was more capable in most ways, more knowledgeable, more experienced, possessed of skills and perspectives that the American girl could not have imagined. But the American girl had had something that the European woman had lost or transformed beyond recognition, a quality of unguardedness, of not yet having learned to be careful, of moving through the world without the constant monitoring that the English social world required. She had been careless in the original sense of the word, without the burden of the continuous self-management that a woman in their position had to maintain. Mary Leiter Curzon's letters from India describe in the later years a quality of tiredness that goes beyond the physical exhaustion of the climate and the ceremonies. She was tired of being the vicereine, not of the work itself, which she had done well and would continue to do, but of the performance of the vicereine, the specific and continuous self-presentation that the role required, the management of every gesture and every expression, and every word for its political and social effects. She had been managing her own presentation since she arrived in London as a young woman from Chicago, and had understood, quickly and clearly, that the way she was perceived was something she could effect through deliberate attention. She had been attending deliberately for 20 years. The exhaustion of performance, of sustained self-management, is not visible in the portraits. The portraits show composed women in beautiful dresses, their faces arranged in the expression that the painter and the sitter and the social world have agreed is appropriate for a woman of their position. The expression is not false, exactly. It is selected. It is the expression they chose to have recorded, which means it is one of the expressions they were capable of, but not necessarily the one they wore most frequently in the private hours. The private hours are what the portraits do not show. The evenings after the dinner party when the guests have gone and the candles are guttering and the fire has burned down to its last heat, and the house is quiet except for the particular sounds of an old house settling into the cold. The mornings when the light is grey and insufficient and the day ahead is full, and you're not quite equal to it yet, and have a few minutes before the maid comes with the breakfast tray, and you have to be the person you have agreed to be. In those private hours, in the spaces between the performances, these women were simply people, not duchesses or viscountesses or princesses or members of parliament, simply women who were tired or happy or anxious or homesick or proud of something or ashamed of something else, who had been given enormous privileges and enormous constraints in the same package, and were navigating both with the resources they had, which were considerable but not inexhaustible. What sustained them, in the private hours, varied by the woman. For Jenny Jerome Churchill it was by all evidence the energy of engagement, the fact that there was always something to do and someone to see, and something to be thought about. For Consuelo Vanderbilt it seems to have been, in the early years at least, the charitable work, the sense of doing something useful in a situation that had not offered her much choice about the other dimensions of her life. For Mary Leiter Curzon it was her husband, which is the simplest and least complicated and perhaps the most honest answer. She loved him, and the love sustained her through the exhausting and the difficult, and when he was present the difficult was bearable. For Winneretta Singer it was the music, always and throughout, in every season and every decade and every transformation of the world around her, it was the music, the fact of it being possible, the fact that she could go into the room where it happened and sit down and hear something that had not existed before and that existed now because she had made it possible for it to exist. This is not nothing. It is, in the accounting of a life, rather a great deal. There is a specific quality to an English November afternoon that you learn to recognise if you have spent enough of them in the same place. The light begins to go at 2 o'clock, slowly at first, then more quickly, the sky moving through a sequence of greys from silver to pewter to the particular dark blue that comes just before the last of the light disappears. The trees have already lost most of their leaves by this point, their forms simplified against the sky, the branches making the patient and complicated shapes of things that have been doing this for a long time. The grass in the park is very green still, the way English grass is always very green because it rains often enough to keep it so, and the green against the darkening sky has a specific vividness that you do not get in other places. By the time these women were old, they had learned the specific quality of this light. They had sat at the windows of their English houses for decades and had watched the November afternoons go through their sequence, and the watching had become, over years, a form of knowledge that was in the body rather than in the mind. They knew without thinking about it what kind of day it was going to be from the light at 7 in the morning. They knew from the sound of the wind in the park whether the temperature would drop overnight. They knew the house in the way that only very long residence creates, the way that a person knows a language when they have spoken it for 50 years, not with the effortful attention of a learner, but with the automatic fluency of someone for whom the language is simply how thought happens. This is perhaps what it means to belong to a place, not to have been born there, not to have grown up there, but to have been there long enough and fully enough that the place has shaped you in ways that cannot be undone. The cold of the English house was no longer cold to them in the way that it had been cold to the young woman from New York, who had arrived at Blenheim for the first time, and found the grandeur and the draughtiness in equal measure incomprehensible. It was simply the temperature of the rooms, the same temperature they had been for 300 years, the temperature of a building built before central heating was imagined. Consuelo Vanderbilt Marlborough lived to 86. She died in 1964, having outlasted her duke, her second husband, and most of the social world she had spent her adult life navigating. She died in England, as she had lived in England, and she was buried at Bladen, the churchyard at the gates of Blenheim, as she had requested. She had written her memoir in 1953 and had given her assessment of the exchange, the glitter and the gold, with the honesty of a woman who has the advantage of years and clarity. But she had also, at the end of it, requested to be buried at the palace she had arrived at in tears, and had managed with intelligence, and had left, and had eventually, in some way, accepted as the place that had made her who she was. Nancy Astor lived to 84. She died in 1964 as well, the same year as Consuelo, at Grimsthorpe in Lincolnshire, at a house that had been lent to her by friends. She had lost Clevedon years earlier, the house that had been given to the National Trust in 1942, and she had spent her later years in a diminished version of the world she had managed so well. She had lost her parliamentary seat in 1945, at the urging of her husband who thought the time had come for her to retire, and she had not forgiven him for it, which was characteristic. She was a woman who was not good at diminishment. But she had been the first woman to sit in the British Parliament, and that could not be undone, and in her old age she received the visitors who came to see her for that reason, with the grace of a woman who has done something permanent and knows it. Winnaretta Singer died in London in November of 1943 at 78, having come from Paris to England when the war made Paris impossible. She had been the Princesse de Polignac for 50 years. She had held the salon for almost that long. The musicians she had commissioned and supported and given space to work in had, between them, produced a body of work that would still be played in concert halls a century after the soirée on Avenue Henri Martin ended. She died in a country that was not the one she had spent her adult life in, and not the one she had been born in, which was appropriate. She had spent her life in the spaces between fixed categories, in the particular freedom available to a woman of enormous wealth and unconcealable intelligence who had found, in a France that was not yet hers, and in an art form that belonged to no single nation, the conditions in which she could become fully herself. They are gone now, all of them, and the world they inhabited is largely gone too, or has transformed into something that bears only a formal resemblance to what it was. The great houses are hotels and museums and National Trust properties. The social season is a pale echo of what it was in the years when the dollar princesses navigated it with such practiced precision. The English aristocracy is smaller and less powerful and less clear about its own purpose than it was in 1895. The specific machinery that had brought these women across the Atlantic, the publication listing eligible lords, the matchmaking hostesses, the elaborate negotiation of dowries, is entirely defunct. What remains is the record, the portraits, the letters, the memoir that Consuelo wrote, the Paris salon that commissioned Debussy and Ravel and continued, in the foundation Winnaretta endowed, to commission new music. The Plymouth constituency that Nancy Astor represented for 25 years, and that changed in ways that take decades to measure, because it had been represented by someone who thought certain things mattered that had not been thought to matter before. The repaired roofs of the English country houses, the restored gardens. What also remains is the story itself, the story of a specific transaction between the old world and the new that was conducted in the currency of daughters and turned out to be about something more complicated than any of its original parties had anticipated. The fathers had sold their daughters for titles and had got them. The English lords had sold their titles for money and had got that too. And the daughters had been sold into a life that was supposed to be a fairy tale and had turned out to be something more resistant and interesting. An actual life, with an actual difficulty and actual work and actual loss, and in many cases actual love and actual achievement, and the specific irreplaceable satisfaction of having become, through long effort, someone you might not have predicted but can fully recognize as yourself. The ship moves slowly in the morning mist. The English coast is emerging from the grey, its particular contours becoming gradually distinct. The young woman at the railing has not moved. Her gloved hands are still on the cold iron. She's watching the land she's agreed to make her own, with the precise and undeceived attention of someone who has made a decision and is committed to the consequences of it. She does not know yet what the consequences are. She does not know about the cold house or the cold husband, or the particular quality of English silence in rooms that have been formal for 300 years. She does not know about the charity work or the political engagement or the conversations that will happen in her drawing room, the ones that will change the people who have them. She does not know about the dreams of America that will come to her in the deepest winter, vivid and brief, and then dissolve in the grey English morning. She does not know that she's going to stay. She does not know that staying is going to make her something different from what she is now, something shaped by weather and obligation, and the long work of being present in a specific place for a very long time. She does not know that what she leaves behind, when she finally leaves it, will be the shape of herself, pressed into the landscape the way a hand pressed into soft clay leaves a lasting impression, the exact contour of the thing that was there. The coast comes closer. The mist is lifting. The land is real and grey and very old, and she's going to step onto it soon and begin the life that she has agreed to and cannot yet imagine. The railing is cold under her gloved hands. The ship moves on. The morning opens around her, slow and grey and full of everything that has not yet happened. She breathes. She watches. She waits. The mist is coming back now. You can feel it in the air, the way the night has grown soft around the edges, the way the sounds of the world have quieted to something distant and unhurried. The ship has long since reached port, and the young woman at the railing has long since stepped onto English soil and begun the life that was waiting for her there. The stories are in the houses and the letters and the gardens and the repaired roofs. The stories are in the long November afternoons and the drawing rooms lit by firelight and the November graves in English churchyards. Let the ship go now. Let it recede into the grey distance of the Atlantic, its wake spreading and smoothing and disappearing into the water. Let the coastline fade back into mist. Let the names and the houses and the long complicated lives settle gently, like snow settling on a January morning, covering everything with a quiet even white. You're somewhere warm now, somewhere still. The night is around you, soft and complete, and the world beyond the walls of where you are is very far away. The crossing is over. The arrival is long past. What was agreed to has been lived. What was built has been built, and is standing still in the English countryside, the stone and the gardens and the repaired roofs, enduring through the centuries with the patient permanence of things that were made to last. Rest now. The fires have burned low in the English houses and the November light has finally gone, and the long, complicated, brilliant, practical, useful, difficult, extraordinary lives are quietly over, settled into the earth of the country they were lived in, belonging to it the way only the dead can fully belong to anywhere. Sleep well. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. If you had been one of these Gilded Age heiresses, offered a title and a castle in Europe in exchange for leaving everything you knew behind, do you think you would have taken the crossing? Let me know in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight.